Good morning, Commissioner Hall.
Good morning, Judy. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I see that it's 9:31 and we could start the IRP workshop in case number 21-00128 UT. Or we could wait. We're going to start with some introductory remarks by Commissioner Hall. If you're ready, Commissioner, we can start.
Sure, I am ready. And, we have a lot of other things to cover. I think it's probably fine. So I wanted to welcome everyone today again to our second workshop in this matter, in this case. And thank you again for participating and giving it your time and your interest. We at the Commission are trying to proceed with our rulemakings in a way that's as inclusive as possible and that really drills into issues that are contentious so that we can achieve a deeper understanding and hopefully reach better consensus with parties. And I think it's a practice that we haven't pursued so much in the past, but I want to see us continue to do going forward because I think it really bears fruit. And I think the comments we received in this last round from all of you have been very helpful for us. And I feel it's helped stimulate our thinking more productively. And I think that we can continue to have a give and take that will help us all have a better appreciation for what we're going forward to create and also lower the anxiety level associated with things like this a lot too. So in the agenda we have for you today, we've tried to lay out our reactions so far, but we see this as a continuing sort of iterative process and hope that you'll have comments and response as well to help us keep moving this conversation going forward. Certainly after reviewing everything that's been submitted, I'm thinking that we probably would want to do at least another session. And but that this has been very productive. So I hope you feel the same way that I do, because I'd like to think that this is a process that we can use going forward that involves a lot more collaboration between the Commission and the interested parties, all the stakeholders, and certainly the regulated entities. So without further ado, I really can't justify having a talking head here, being a politico going on when there's a lot of work to do here. So I'm gonna hand the agenda back over to Judy and just repeat my continuing thanks for everybody participating and being willing to consider all sides of issues and hopefully help us get to a rule that will work for everyone. So thank you very much for being here. That's it, Judy.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Commissioner. Next on the agenda is me. I will present maybe a fascinating PowerPoint for lawyers, but for non-lawyers, maybe not so much. Anyway, Isaac was going to do the screen sharing, and thank you. So the reason that we have had this PowerPoint produced is because a lot of the commenters commented on the Commission's authority to amend the IRP rule. Obviously, we can amend the existing IRP rule, but what can the amendments contain is really the issue. Next slide. There's a variety of different statutes that give the Commission the authority to regulate integrated resource plans of utilities. And I guess one of the sticking points has been the regulation of procurements and the extent of regulation of procurements. And as you can see from this slide, there's section 884B10 and the Public Utility Act 6231. The Commission has the power to adopt such reasonable administrative, regulatory, and procedural rules as may be necessary or appropriate to carry out its powers and duties. So this means that if we have specific statutory authority, we have general authority to promulgate reasonable, appropriate rules if they're necessary. The Public Utility Act 6231B expressly grants the Commission authority and imposes a duty on the Commission to ensure fair, just, and reasonable rates. That is the Public Regulation Commission's duty and mission. And everything we do is derived from that. And it states here, it is the declared policy of the state that the public interest and the interest of consumers and the interest of investors require the regulation and supervision. And so both of those words are interesting because regulation means rules, requirements, limits, and supervision means overseeing of public utilities to the end that reasonable and proper services, again, the word reasonable, shall be available at fair, just, and again, reasonable rates. And to the end that capital and investment may be encouraged and attracted so as to provide for the construction, development, and extension. And this is important too, without unnecessary duplication and economic waste. So obviously the legislature is concerned about economics for all, for the utility and the customer, of proper plants and facilities and demand side resources for the rendition of service to the general public and to industry. So these two sections alone give us authority, but we have even more authority. Next slide. Next slide, okay. There have been some challenges that have said well, the PRC doesn't have authority to regulate procurements because there's not a statute that says the PRC has authority to regulate procurements of all utilities. But as you know, the Supreme Court has rejected that type of, the Supreme Court of New Mexico has rejected that type of argument. Just because the legislature didn't expressly state it, the lack of such authority does not imply that no authority was granted. And I'm referring to Public Service Company of New Mexico versus New Mexico Public Service Commission and New Mexico Industrial Energy Consumers and the Attorney General of the state of New Mexico in 1987 case 106 and M622. And in P&M made that claim, which is similar to claims made in this docket. And they stated, and this was regarding approval of a financial restructuring. And the court said, in this instance, we construe no intent from legislative inaction. However, it is well settled that courts should accord deference to the interpretation given to a statute by the agency with which it is addressed. Again, that's a universal principle that's been enunciated by the Supreme Court. Furthermore, P&M's interpretation of section 62.619 would strip the commission of its ability to protect ratepayers from the adverse effects of the holding company restructuring until the impact has occurred. This court must interpret statutes in a way which will not render their application unreasonable nor defeat the intended objective of the legislature. To ascertain the legislative intent, we read the entire act as a whole, each part construed with every other part. Read in light of the Public Utility Act statutory framework, Statutory 62.619 gives the commission the authority to promulgate General Order 39. In other words, if we were to accept the argument that the commission has no authority over procurements, to regulate procurements until after they have occurred, that would render a lot of our other statutory duties to ensure fair, just, and reasonable rates. That would basically defeat the intended objective to have fair, just, and reasonable rates. So I do not believe that the mere lack of express authority that regarding the regulation of procurement means that the commission has no authority. It does have to be within limits, and I'm going to get to that on the next slide. So this comes to how much regulate. The real issue is not whether or not we can regulate procurements in our amendments of the integrated resource plan rule, but how far can we go? And it is true that the commission is not authorized to manage utility operations or interfere with utility management. And it has also been held by many courts that utility commissions cannot substitute their own judgment for that of utility management. And there is a statutory section 62.64B, which relates to that principle. It says the sale, furnishing, or delivery of electricity by any person to a utility for resale or for the public shall be subject to regulation by commission, but only to the extent necessary to enable the commission to determine that the cost to the utility of gas, water, or electricity at the place where the major distribution to the public begin is reasonable, and that the method of delivery of the gas, water, or electricity are adequate. So again, commissions are not authorized to necessarily, they're not the utility. They don't own the utility, and the utility does have management authority. Next slide. Now I'm going to just go through some specific instances in our statutes where the legislature has actually given us specific authority regarding the regulation of cost-effective portfolio of resources and regulating the procurement of those resources so that they are competitive and cost-effective. The whole point of competitive procurements is to result in a procurement of a cost-effective resource or service or goods. As you know, the state procurement code has the same, that's the exact same purpose. Without competition, there is no cost effectiveness. I'm not going to read over the section 62-1710. You can see it. This is specific rulemaking authority regarding integrated resource planning. And a key part of this statute is in order to identify the most, again, cost-effective portfolio of resources to supply the energy needs of customers. Procurement is the beginning of the most cost-effective procurement of resources. Next slide. So in conclusion, the question is whether the regulation of utility procurements is necessary and appropriate to carry out the powers and duties to ensure that rates charged to customers are fair, just, and reasonable. And the answer is that the commission does have the authority to regulate procurements as long as it is clear that the commission is not attempting to regulate utility procurements to the extent where it is injecting itself into the internal management of the utility. And I'm citing to Pennsylvania case, Duquesne Light Company versus Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission, 507 ATD 1274, 1986 case. Next slide. And there's some other cases that support the proposition that public regulation must not supplant private management, but there are cases that delineate how far you can go. New Mexico industrial energy consumers versus New Mexico Public Service Commission, a 1991 case, 111 NM 622. And because the rule that we are trying to promulgate at this point, we haven't finalized it yet, but it's intended to, and it does not allow the commission to substitute itself for the utility management decisions on resource planning or procurement. And that's the reason we believe that this rule is consistent with the PUA and well-established case law. Next slide. I'm just going to go through a variety of statutes that literally say the commission can regulate competitive bidding. The Efficient Use of Energy Act 6217(5)(e) specifically uses the word competitive bidding, competitive bids. Next slide. The Energy Transition Act specifically says commission approval of competitively procured replacement resources. Again, projects ranked based on cost. Cost and competitive procurements go hand in hand. Next slide. The Renewable Energy Act also requires competitive procurements. A was the result of competitive procurement that included opportunities for bidders to propose purchase power, facility self-build, or facility build transfer options. And that section 6216(4) is G, is part of the renewable portfolio standard section, which contains all of the new benchmarks to get to zero carbon. And so again, it was included right in that same section 6216(4), which means that the legislature intended that the commission would ensure that there were competitive procurements to get to the new renewable portfolio standards. Next slide. This slide is a repetition of everything I just said, but I'll go through it anyway. It's true that there is not a New Mexico statute that says that the commission has the authority to regulate RFPs and procurements. And it is true that the commission does not have the authority to inject itself in the internal management of a public utility. However, the commission has the authority to impose regulations regarding procurements because the commission may regulate utilities where their actions affect the public they serve, and may regulate the rates charged by utilities because that affects the public. It's undisputed that the commission has an ongoing duty to protect the public from unreasonable rates. Therefore, and again, it goes back to our duty to ensure fair, just, and reasonable rates. Therefore, the commission can regulate procurements to the extent that the regulations are aimed at ensuring that the utility is prudent in incurring certain expenses so that rates are reasonable, fair, and just. If regulations, and a benefit to this type of regulation is that if regulations are designed to ensure procurements are prudent, that will also benefit the utility when it files an application to recover those expenses dollar for dollar from its customers. And that is all I have regarding this. And we have a discussion period later if anyone wants to discuss this. But at this point, I will go on to our next person on the agenda, which is Colin.
Thank you, Judy. I want to make sure that my microphone is at a reasonable volume. Can you understand me, Commissioner Hall?
Yes, it's noticeably louder to me, and I'm really pleased. Thank you for whatever you did.
I think I finally figured that out. Okay,
Good.
let me get to my screen share 1 second here. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Judy, is the screen share
Yes.
working? Okay. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of the changes that we made in response to the comments and feedback from the parties from workshop 1, which was on June 22nd. So we're just going to go over the changes to the draft rule itself. And to provide a brief overview, the objective section, it now clarifies the PRC's statutory obligations. So this is pursuant to what Judy was just discussing in terms of the Commission's mandate to provide for fair, just, and reasonable rates. That was the Public Utility Act, Section 62.3.1. And we also have an update in the Integrated Resource Plan section that there's a provision for multi-jurisdictional utilities. I'm not going to get too much into that, but Assistant Robert Lundy will present on that. And then we also have several updates in the facilitated stakeholder process. So we now have reasonable modeling accommodations for stakeholders and staff. We streamlined that public advisory process and we cut out a lot of unnecessary language there that may have been redundant or confusing. We've also streamlined the process for adjudication in absence of agreement as a result of the facilitated stakeholder process. And I think one of the really important changes that we've made since the last workshop is the removal of the supermajority provision. We definitely listened to your feedback, and there were some very persuasive arguments that perhaps some bidders could enter into the facilitated stakeholder process and sort of game the system or just have an overwhelming number of participants um, that could provide for a supermajority that would sort of crowd out the opinions of the utilities and other stakeholders. I'm not saying that that's the only method of that gaming the system for that supermajority provision, but we did recognize that that caused some issues, and so I think this is a responsive change, and I'll go over that in just a couple of minutes here. We've also updated the statement of need and action plan, just specifying that there's no presumption of prudence. However, there is still a rebuttable presumption in the cost recovery section if there are no material changes or deviations from the statement of need and action plan that the commission has reviewed and approved. In the request for proposals section, we've substituted the language that required commission approval for a comment process. And this was in response to the various arguments from you all that that we were effectively usurping your managerial authority, your discretion to run the utilities. And we talked about this at length internally, and we decided that was a really persuasive argument and that we needed to go in a different direction. So instead of requiring approval at that point, what the commission will do is provide input, and that input can be considered by the utility, but it's not mandatory to comply. However, it would be beneficial when prudency and cost recovery comes into the picture later on. We also clarified when the utility may issue the proposed RFP. I think that we had some redundant and confusing language there. So we've eliminated some language there and just made that a little bit easier to understand. We think it flows more naturally now. And one of the other responsive changes that we've made in this draft is that we've eliminated the potential takings provision. And that was the provision that utilities make available their actual facilities in the public advisory process or the facilitated stakeholder process. But we've made that much more permissive. We've cut a lot of language out of that, and we're hoping that we can reach agreement that this eliminates that takings issue. And finally, I think I referenced this earlier, but in the determination of the resource portfolio, we've removed the unnecessary public advisory process language. And that's because we do have that facilitated stakeholder section. So we determined that that was unnecessary and confusing. And that was also in response to your feedback. And I wanted to say at the outset that your feedback was really helpful. We had a lot of internal discussions about the points, and I just wanted to thank everyone at the previous workshop that spoke up and really helped us with making these, I would say, much needed changes. So now I'm going to get into the actual changes that we have here. In the objective section, we just added a sentence that relates to, or actually it stems from, the Public Utility Act, section 62(3)(1, and that's the Commission's obligations to ensure fair, just, and reasonable rates. I don't think that that's going to be a controversial change. And then in the Integrated Resource Plan section, we did understand, that there are some concerns about the multi-jurisdictional aspect of some of the utilities, particularly SPS. Robert Lundin will discuss that in more depth, but I want to make sure that we just included this updated language for your review in this presentation. Then in the facilitated stakeholder process, what we did is we changed, the mandate of having the utilities make available their actual facilities, and we just supplanted that with reasonable access to the same modeling software. This would be akin to, I think, what PNM recently did with the replacement resource case in San Juan Generating Station. Then we had a lot of language here in terms of timelines, and we had this supermajority clause that I referred to in the overview section of the presentation. We took all that out. That could be highly contentious, and we don't want to make this process more adversarial than it needs to be. So the updated language says, if after 4 months the utility and stakeholders cannot come to an agreement, the case shall be submitted to the Commission for adjudication of the Statement of Need and Action Plan. Now, hopefully that doesn't happen. Hopefully the newest draft provides for something that leads to a reasonable outcome and an agreement. Then we've also taken out this section here and moved it up. And I think I showed that in the previous slide, but we just relocated this. And then in terms of the statement of need, this is just the part that talks about how there's no presumption of prudence in a subsequent case for cost recovery. And we have, this language is actually mirrored in the action plan at the end as well. I don't think that that's going to be controversial, and especially in light of the fact that we have that rebuttable presumption in the cost recovery section. So this is just some timing language here. This was a little bit confusing, and it's just a little bit more streamlined now. And the same thing here. This is just to prevent any confusion and make it easier to understand how the process flows. We did receive some comments that it was a little bit confusing. And I think just removing some extraneous language helps the legibility of the document. Okay, and here there are some issues just with the word feasible. We understand that that term is subject to litigation, and again, we really want to make this process just, I guess, easier to come to a consensus, or if not a consensus, at least an agreement or compromise. And then again, this is where we took out that potential takings provision. So here we have the utility's real property and facilities, either owned or controlled by the utility or its affiliate. And there was a mandate here. It's compulsory, shall be made. And we took that out. So I'm hoping, I mean, we're all hoping that everyone will find these changes more agreeable. And then here in the determination of the resource portfolio, Judy did mention, pursuant to section 62-1710, that the commission does have a duty to help determine the most cost-effective resource portfolio. But, and I think that does include a public advisory process. Our version of that is the facilitated stakeholder process. And so all of this language here was somewhat redundant and confusing. And I don't think we need multiple public advisory processes here. Hopefully, we can reach an agreement in that initial facilitated stakeholder process. And this is going to be it for my presentation. We didn't make very many changes, but the ones that we made were in direct response to your feedback, which again, we really, really appreciate. And we're going to have a comments and questions section after the presentations are concluded. And again, we really welcome your feedback and your participation in this process. And now I'll hand it over to Commissioner Fishman's assistant, Robert Lundeen. Or, oh, go ahead, Judy. I'm sorry.
Colin, could you go back a couple slides? There was one thing I wanted you to.
Sure. Let me go back. Sorry, I ended the screen share prematurely. Okay.
And maybe you did, let's see. Hmm.
Do you know which section we were talking about, Judy?
It was before this one. Let's see. Oh, the fact that in D there, that we deleted that last sentence. Did we move that to another place?
Yeah, so we've moved it to here under A of the facilitated stakeholder process.
Well, it's different there though, right?
Yeah, I think if you look at the former version of the rule, which is in the docket, and the new rule, and I can just read this out loud here. The utility shall provide commission staff and stakeholders reasonable access to the same modeling software used by the utility on equal footing as the utility in accordance with commission precedent, and the utility shall share all modeling information. And obviously we have some differences in spelling here, 2 L's here, 1 L here. We can clean that up.
No, but I'm saying in that prior sentence, it
Mhm.
said that the utility shall not issue RFPs prior to a final order. In D, the final,
Okay.
that sentence is deleted there. Is it moved to another place?
No, I don't believe so. I think that is deleted. And I think when we were making changes to timing and the flow of the process, I don't think that that's in there now. But let me just say that subject to check, and I can look at that and provide an update at the end of Art's presentation, if that would be okay.
Yeah, okay, that
Okay.
would be good.
All right,
All
I'm
right.
writing that down for follow-up. And thank you, Judy, for catching that.
Yeah. Yeah, and next we'll go to Robert Lundy. He is the assistant to Commissioner Fishman, who will, a lot of multi-jurisdictional issues were raised in the comments, and Robert will specifically try to address those.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you, Colin. Let me share my screen real quick. Okay, can everyone see what's on my screen?
Yes, we got it.
Yes.
Okay, to repeat, I'm Robert Lundeen. A lot of you may remember me from my time with the Attorney General's office, but I have since moved on. I'm working with Commissioner Fishman now as his executive assistant. And I'd like to just talk about some of the issues raised in the commentary portion of the case or of the rulemaking regarding the multi-jurisdictional utilities. So first, it's good to take a look at the statute. Obviously, the commission has a duty, and that duty is to take into account these multi-jurisdictional issues and to authorize the utilities to implement plans that coordinate their requirements in both states. So what's interesting about the existing rule is that it doesn't really discuss what the commission shall do or what the utilities shall do to implement and coordinate these plans. So when you look at the existing rule, first of all, the only section that speaks about multi-jurisdictional utilities at all is housed under 17.7.3.14, which is an exemptions provision. So first of all, it kind of doesn't make sense where it is. And then additionally, the rule kind of just restates what the statute says. It's not very instructive. It lacks procedure. But we did not, we didn't make any changes to this part of the rule. We didn't add anything. We didn't subtract anything when we developed the proposed draft. And we kind of just left it as is. But, kind of considering our goal is to trim the fat of this rule, it probably should just be eliminated because it's really just restating what is already said in statute and doesn't provide any additional helpful information. So many issues were brought up during the commentary phase. Kind of to run through those issues, basically the draft proposed rule did not take into account the requirements of multi-jurisdictional utilities. It was incompatible with the obligations of multi-jurisdictional utilities. It would force multi-jurisdictional utilities to kind of reinvent how they handle supply. It would force procurement on a jurisdiction-specific basis. It could dictate the selection of resources for Texas customers. It would increase costs, it would increase risks, and it would create kind of legal and practical impediments to new acquisitions. So these were kind of the issues that were brought up in the commentary phase. Not to be too critical at this point, but many of these issues were kind of stated in conclusory ways. So we would just ask that please in the additional rounds of commentary and workshops that we have to kind of detail the reasons why these issues are true, and maybe that we can do something to address them better than what we've tried to do today. And we'll get to that in a sec. There are also several counter proposals proposed in the commentary. One of these was that the draft proposed rule should not apply to multi-jurisdictional utilities. And we can just respond to that by saying, that would pretty much just be impermissible because we have a statute that requires all utilities to have an IRP, but for very limited circumstances. So, so any kind of counter proposals or counter ideas that basically take the IRP requirements out of the, the duties of the multi-jurisdictional utilities would just be kind of impermissible. Same with the draft rule should be voluntary. It kind of falls under that same category. We have a mandatory statute here. One of the counter proposal ideas is that the requirements of the draft proposed rule should only apply to resources that are dedicated to serve New Mexico. Kind of my first take on that was that it might render the IRP rule a nullity for multi-jurisdictional utilities because, for the vast majority of their procurements and acquisitions, they're making it on a system-wide basis and not just on a New Mexico basis. So if the rule was only to apply to New Mexico specific procurements, I'm not sure that the rule would have much force and effect for multi-jurisdictional utilities. And then another idea was that New Mexico customers should be responsible for 100% of the costs of procurements made pursuant to the draft proposed rule. I think this raises an interesting question that, what happens when a procurement made pursuant to the IRP statute or the IRP rule is not approved in the other jurisdiction. So for our purposes in Texas. And I think that can be addressed by what the utility proposes in their IRP. If they propose some sort of alternative or plan in the event that Texas doesn't approve the portfolio that is selected, that's something that we can account for ahead of time. But I think in that case, I think the onus is on the utility to try to plan for that circumstance. But in response to the comments and from the first workshop, we did include a new provision in our proposal draft rule. It's part C here on the screen in red. Basically, a multi-jurisdictional utility shall include in its IRP a description of its resource planning requirements in the other states that it operates and a proposal for how to coordinate the IRP with its out-of-state resource planning requirements. Basically, what we think this does, it tracks the language of the statute, it expands on the language of the statute, but it doesn't just restate it as the existing rule does. It kind of provides a procedure for utilities to follow, but it leaves it open so that utilities can kind of craft their proposal the way they want to. And, it puts the utility in the driver's seat, which is, I think, the correct thing to do because the utility is best situated to understand its regulatory burdens in both jurisdictions. So, in a commentary and future workshops, or right now in this workshop, I'd like for the utilities and any other commentators to please, expand on this direction that we've taken, or present, permissible alternative ideas that we can take into account and consider. But, we hope to see that in the next round of commentary. And I would actually open this up for a limited discussion, to Ms. Burns or Mr. Dubois or anyone else who has any ideas. Your take on this addition to the draft rule, maybe larger issues in general related to multi-jurisdictional utilities. We have a few minutes that you can take the floor now if you choose. Thank you.
Would anyone like to talk about it now? We could actually save it for the comment period if that's preferable. It seems like that might be the best way to do it, Robert.
Okay.
And at this point, I think we should move on to Art O'Donnell, who will be talking about the independent monitor and other issues.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you, everyone. Good morning. I'm going to put up my slides and run them from here. So my is paused. Why is this paused? Getting a message that says my screen sharing is paused. I'm going to stop and then start again. Is our IT person on? I'm having difficulty sharing my screen for some reason.
Isaac, are you around?
I am. The screen sharing paused thing is not really a setting that I have control over. That's a setting on each. Like it's if you start sharing your screen and then maybe move your focus of the computer to something else. That's when it says screen sharing is paused. If you want to email me whatever you want to share, I could put it up for you. Perhaps.
Well, let me try it again.
I think, and Robert did.
There we
Robert,
go. Can you
okay,
see it
great.
now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Minor glitches. Thank you, everyone. Arthur O'Donnell, in support of the Public Regulation Commission on this. We're talking about the role of the independent monitor, and in the previous attempts to update the procurement rule, there was a lot of discussion. There had been a fairly detailed section in the draft rule that went into the use of an independent monitor or evaluator, and kind of like at all stages of the commission activity. In this particular draft of the rule, we've really limited the discussion of it, but that opens the door to whether the commission should look further. We did have a couple of comments from parties who believe that the commission ought to require an independent evaluator or an independent monitor in the procurement process. The current version of the rule that's before everyone says that the commission may, at its discretion, assign an independent monitor to ensure competitive bidding process by monitoring the design and implementation of a request for proposals process. And if assigned, the independent monitor shall file a report with the commission. That's the extent of the language in the current draft, and it's section 177314. The purpose of this presentation is to go a little bit deeper in terms of what an independent monitor or evaluator would do, and some examples from around the country of other states that use them. And what we'd like to do is to open the door for further consideration of this, whether the commission ought to be requiring the use of an independent monitor, or if there are circumstances that would benefit from the use of it, and not necessarily have a monitor in every instance, but in some instances, and we'll get into what those instances might be, right? So first of all, just to draw a distinction between a monitor and an evaluator, right? These terms are used commonly in many other states for really kind of like ensuring the fairness of process for requests for proposals or RFQ solicitations. The terms are used interchangeably, but it really comes down to a difference in the scope of the activity, and it should be specifically enumerated in a commission order or in the rule. There is a group called Merrimack Energy Group that is probably the preeminent independent evaluator used throughout the country, had been active in well over 100 cases. And so I called them up and I asked them what's the difference, and they said, well, basically it's whatever term gets used. That from their point of view, there really is no difference, except that sometimes the activities of an independent evaluator are broader than those of a monitor. So we will be using the term independent monitor in the New Mexico rule, but it really comes down to kind of what the expectations are for what that role should be. Okay, why would you use an independent entity? In economic theory, vertically integrated utilities have market power because they're the sole buyers of energy and other services in their territory. This is what's called monopsony power. They control the inputs and the methods for resource planning and the assumptions used to evaluate bids. Without oversight, utilities could control information and impose biases on the procurement process, exercise arbitrary decision-making, erect barriers, unreasonable costs, or impose delays. They might impose terms and conditions that force bidders to accept below market prices or onerous contract terms, right? So that's what we're trying to protect against. And I would endorse everyone to read a report called Best Practices for All Source Electric Generation Procurement, issued last year by Energy Innovation and cleanenergy.org. It's readily available on the internet. It was a very good rundown of best practices for procurement, especially being tied to integrated resource planning. So I drew some of my thoughts on this from that paper. Right. The objective of an independent evaluator is to ensure that the competitive bidding process is undertaken in a fair, efficient, and unbiased manner, with no undue preference provided to the utility self-billed options or to utility affiliates. The independent monitor's involvement generally begins with the development of the RFP and continues through the contract negotiation process. Now, this was taken from testimony by Wayne Oliver, who's the principal of Merrimack Energy, in a case in Arkansas back in 2006. But I think that it holds true today as well. In many jurisdictions, the independent monitor's involvement extends to providing a report or testimony in the decision-making or certification process that's subsequent to the competitive solicitations. The Energy Innovation Clean Energy Group Best Practices Report looked at the public PNM's procurement for the San Juan replacement resources. The outcome was determined after that report was issued and found, quote, PNM used a third party to assist in administering the RFP process, but it was not clear whether it was truly independent. For those of you who were involved in that case, you recall that a joint petition was filed by a number of parties, including the Attorney General, requesting that the commission appoint an independent monitor for that process, but the commission never acted on that. And the PNM utility instead hired a kind of a consulting engineer, right? That just did not sit well with a lot of people, and it turned out that the proposed portfolio of resources that the utility brought to the commission was not that which was accepted, and instead the commission found that a portfolio that was proposed by one of the stakeholder groups was more responsive to the legislation and the intent of the Energy Transition Act. Right. So the Energy Innovation Group, Clean Energy, do recommend the use of an independent monitor or evaluator. Okay. I'm going to go through a few states that use independent monitors or evaluators in their process. And what you'll see are some subtle differences that change the scope of the activity of the independent entity. And really, it's up to each individual state to determine what they want from this role, if they in fact use one. I would say that Colorado has essentially the bare bones, right? This is what they have in their code of regulations that was approved not too long ago, is that that utility, commission staff, and the Office of the Consumer Counsel will agree on the use of an independent evaluator as an advisor to the commission, and it's paid for by the utility. Now, that's common in a lot of states. The IE reviews all documents and data used by the utility in developing its resource plan. So in this case, the independent evaluator is there from the very beginning, even in the development of the resource plan. Submits a report assessing whether the utility conducted a fair bid solicitation and bid evaluation process, and any deficiencies are specifically reported. Parties have 45 days to file comments on the plan and or the IE report, and utilities may also respond. And the commission decision approving, conditioning, modifying, or rejecting the utility's preferred plan is how all this gets approved and put into rates later. Somewhat in contrast, Arizona, in its rules, the load-serving entity must engage an independent monitor to oversee all RFP processes. So it's really up to the utility to hire this entity, but they must consult with commission staff on the identity of the independent monitor. Once again, the independent monitor is paid for by the utility or the load-serving entity, and LSE must submit to the IM any bid proposal, benchmark, or reference cost that the entity uses to evaluate its bid. So it gets essentially a consulting role here. So it's somewhat more limited than what we saw in Colorado. In Oregon, an independent evaluator must be used to ensure that all offers are treated fairly. So again, we have a must use. The commission selects or approves the IE, so that's independent of the utility. And also the IE has to be non-affiliated, has no direct business relations with the utility, its affiliates, or any other potential bidders. The IE is paid by the utility. The utility conducts the RFP, but the IE oversees the process to ensure fairness. And if an RFP allows affiliate bidding or includes utility affiliate ownership, the IE independently scores the benchmark resource, right? So there's a step up in authority for the independent entity in that case if there is a utility involvement in the bidding process as a competitor. In Utah, the use of an IE is required, right? It's hired by the Utah Commission and paid by the utility. So here's another instance in which the commission makes the decision on who the independent entity is. The Division of Public Utilities, IE, is involved in preparing the screening and evaluation criteria, the ranking factors, and evaluation methodology. So that's a real step up in the authority of the independent evaluator in terms of establishing the bid evaluation process. If it's an RFQ, the bidders submit directly to the independent evaluator. The independent evaluator also monitors the utilities evaluation and conducts its own evaluation in consultation with the Division of Public Utilities. Excuse me. Right, so as you can see, as we're going down the spectrum, the responsibilities of the independent entity increase depending on jurisdiction. Right? In Oklahoma, the commission has discretion and may retain an independent evaluator. However, it must be used if a utility affiliate is expected to bid, if the RFP and results may have a material impact on utility cost of service, or if the utility participates as a bidder, right? So it's up to the commission's discretion unless one or more of these conditions applies. and then it must be used. The IE reports to the commission and to the state attorney general in that case, in the state of Oklahoma. Massachusetts possibly has the most detailed regulations and expectations of an independent evaluator, in that the IRP and procurement process is guided by two statutes, right? There's a 2018 Act to Advance Clean Energy, and there's a Clean Green Community Act that was passed subsequent to the 2018 bill. The Department of Energy Resources and the Attorney General jointly select the independent evaluator, and it's contracted to the department, not to the utility, right? So that's different than in most of the other jurisdictions. The independent evaluator issues a report to the department that analyzes the timetable and the method of solicitation and includes recommendations for improving the process. So even before an RFP is put to market, right, the independent evaluator gets involved and can make recommendations for changes. Upon the opening of an investigation into approval of long-term contracts, right, this is after the RFP process, the independent evaluator will file a report summarizing and analyzing the solicitation and process. The IE provides an assessment of whether all proposals were evaluated fairly and objectively, and the IE review will include the reasonableness of the procurement target and schedule, any price cap if used, the fairness of the RFP terms and conditions, and any issues that were raised by its review. So in this case, the independent evaluator actually has a very strong analytical basis for making recommendations to the commission in its decision-making on whether the contracts that emanate from a solicitation are reasonable. And that's somewhat different than we've seen in many of the other jurisdictions, in which, while the independent monitor or evaluator will issue a report, there's not this specificity of what's looked at and the actual determination of reasonableness that would go into the decision-making process. So we've kind of gone along a spectrum here, from a very bare bones use of an independent monitor to, as the expectations and the scope of activities for the independent entity get more detailed and more prescriptive, it really then becomes an evaluator rather than just a monitor. Right, so just in conclusion, right, there may be a difference in the terminology between independent evaluator and independent monitor, but the distinction really relates to the scope of activities. And that should be explicitly detailed in the statement of work, the scope of work that's used to hire the IE. Best practice recommendations in many states require the use of an independent entity. There is no valid argument that an independent entity represents an improper substitution for utility management discretion or judgment. As was discussed by Judith earlier, they're not substituting their judgment, but they are making an evaluation for the regulator to do its job. And the regulator's job, of course, is to ensure both fairness of process and that the rates that accompany resource acquisitions are fair, just, and reasonable. The selection of an independent entity may be made by the utility, and in fact, in most jurisdictions it is, or done in consultation or direct approval by the regulator. And we have at least one state as an example in which the independent entity is actually hired by the regulatory body. The utility in all cases pays for the services, and that's of course recouped in rates. The independent evaluator and involvement can start with the creation of the RFP documents, goes through negotiations, and may go all the way through the regulatory process to approve final contracts. And in some states, the independent evaluator, like in Arkansas, as we saw, actually provides testimony in the proceeding that determines the reasonableness of a contract, right? So we can see that we have many options, and what we'd like to do is to get more comment on this issue as to the appropriateness of the use of an independent entity in New Mexico. We have the option of saying that the commission has discretion to use one, but for example, like in Utah, if a utility is bidding itself or an affiliate of the utility is bidding, or if the procurement is of substantial effect on utility rates, that then an independent evaluator would be required, right? So we have a spectrum of ways of going about this, and we'd certainly like to get some more comment on this as we move down the path of finalizing the procurement rule, because that's really where this would come into play. We do have a little bit of time if there's any questions at this point. And I know that we did receive some specific recommendations on the use of an independent evaluator or monitor in the previous version, the 030 case from 2018. And I would certainly like to hear from the parties that were involved in that discussion to talk about whether it's appropriate for us to include a more detailed description of an independent entity's role and function in this rule. So with that, I'll turn it back to Judith, and we can either move to a break now, or we can have a little bit of conversation about this since it's not really part of what's in the rule currently.
Yes, thank you, Art. And you know, I actually think this would be a good time to talk about the independent monitor. And we have till 11 to do that. So, and you are also correct that we did receive comments in that prior 1830 docket. So given the fact that as you detailed very well, there's a variety of ways to go, it would be very helpful to get feedback from
Okay, one of the parties that was most involved in this, actually in the previous case, they were under a different name. It was Southwest Generation, which has changed its name to Onward Energy. And I know that their representative, Joseph Yar, is with us today. And I'm wondering if Joseph has any specific comments on this issue. So just unmute yourself, Joseph, and join the conversation.
Thank you, Art. I appreciate it. Thank you, Judith, and the commission for this opportunity to provide comments on the independent monitor / evaluator. I'd like to begin by saying that I thought, Art, you did a great job in kind of doing a survey of all the different types of processes that are out there and the different states that employ them. Onward is very interested in this portion of the rulemaking, along with the other portions too. We stand by the comments that we filed previously in this proceeding. I think it's an important aspect of it. I think there should be a rule that addresses this specifically and independent from the IRP, although there is overlap in it. Onward would like to see and participate with the other stakeholders on this issue. It's something that I think this jurisdiction has been struggling with for quite some time. And it's something that I think all parties would benefit from a little bit more transparency, or a lot more transparency in the process. With that said, as I mentioned earlier, Onward stands by the current proposals that he has provided for in the previous filing, the 18-0030 proceeding, one in which an independent monitor is involved in the process from the beginning. But again, I don't want to kind of overstep where we stand. I kind of leave it there, and if there's any other comments or thoughts.
Quick question, Joseph. Did in the previous docket, did Onward or Southwest Generation propose any specific language?
Yes, Judy, we did propose some specific language. Let me just look at that real quick. We filed them in our initial comments. I believe they were filed on May 13th, 2019. And it was a specific section with some detailed language in there. I don't have the ability to share the screen with it. I don't know if the commission has that, or if anyone has that. I'm more than happy to share it. I did file it in connection with my initial comments.
Can you read what you have there?
Sure. We went along the route of creating a specific section rule, and we named it appointment and functions of an independent monitor. I can read through it. It's a couple of pages long. I think everyone's kind of familiar with it, at least the other stakeholders that were involved in it. Do you want me to kind of go through it section by section?
Yeah, or just, summarize the high points, in terms of, you said that you wanted the independent monitor involved from the beginning, but do they, who are they hired by? How are they picked? Do they provide a report to the commission? Some of those issues.
Sure. So to begin with, I think one of the overarching themes in the comments that we filed was that the role of the independent monitor would be more or less tied to advising staff. So I think that's one of the bigger overarching themes that we wanted to kind of ensure that was something that that the commission was comfortable with. I think that the objectives of the proposed rule and the benefits are outlined in that specific section that we filed. Let me see if I could pull that up. So in section C of the rule, we wanted to see if the commission would be okay with, in the rule development, a standard of a form contract for independent monitors. The commission, in our rule, as we stated here, the commission shall develop a standard form of contract between the independent monitor and utility that requires the independent monitor to perform the functions of an independent monitor as provided in the rule in a manner that is not subject to the control of the soliciting utility. The standard form of contract for independent monitor shall include the independent monitor's verification that the independent monitor has not assisted or provided any services to the soliciting utility, any affiliate of the utility, or likely bidders for 2 years prior to the effective date of the contract. And 2, the agreement that the independent monitor is prohibited from assisting or providing any services to the soliciting utility, any affiliates of the utility, or to any entity that submits proposals to utility for a period of 2 years from the effective date of the contract. The commission may solicit public comments regarding other terms and conditions in the standard form of contract in a manner that is transparent to the public. The other question that you raised, Judith, is who can initiate this? And according to our rules, our proposal, we would suggest that the appointment of the independent monitor be done by the commission.
In every case, or certain pieces?
Our rule, our proposal is kind of open to that. We are open to potential discussions on which cases that should be. I think initially, from a starting point, I think we would propose it to be in every case that involves procurement or bidding on substantial facilities that the utility is proposing. Anything that would affect the evaluation of the most cost-effective portfolio.
Well, thank you for your comments. And is Leslie or any other participant like to weigh in on the independent monitor?
Yes, Ms. Amer, this is Leslie Padilla, Counsel for Public Service Company of New Mexico. Thank you for letting us comment on this provision, and thank you, Mr. O'Donnell, for your presentation. As you noted, Judy, PNM did address this issue in the 18-00030 docket. And we did actually in that case attach suggested language to amend the proposed rule that the commission was considering in that docket. Our comments in that proceeding were designed to make the provision more flexible, to ensure that the independent monitor would in fact be independent. And we did frame it as an independent monitor, not an evaluator, because we do think that actually has different meaning. So yeah, we really believe the independent monitor should be independent and not connected closely to the commission. I think Mr. Yar's proposal actually is we would be opposed to that. We also made comments to the effect that the cost recovery of any costs for an independent monitor and evaluator should be insured. Mr. O'Donnell assumed that, but he said, that cost would of course be recouped by the utilities, but that should be, we think, specifically spelled out in a rule. And what I wanted to suggest was that if the commission wants to add language about the independent monitor or an independent evaluator in this proceeding, that an actual draft of language be circulated before folks are able to make comments, so that we can actually make comments on an actual proposed rule. I do have with me one of our subject matter expert, PNM's Director of Resource Planning, Nicholas Phillips, is here, and he can speak briefly more to the merits of the topic. So thank you very much for my opportunity to speak.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I apologize, I'm having some video issues, so I'm not able to turn my camera on at the moment. The main thing I wanted to comment on in terms of the scoping between an independent monitor or independent evaluator, I guess the way that I would consider the difference between the two. The purpose I would see is in order to ensure a fair and unbiased process, looking over the shoulder of the RFP evaluation and making sure that everybody's getting a fair shake, right? I think what we would have concerns with is if the scope gets so broad to where an independent monitor turns into an independent evaluator, where they then start running models and making recommendations on what resources would actually be coming out of a procurement, as opposed to making sure that there's just a fair and unbiased process. So that's the comment I would like to make is, I think of the independent monitor in terms of ensuring a fair and unbiased process. When you move to an evaluator, they're running a parallel evaluation and coming up with recommendations. And I think that can lead to more confusion and more problems in the process, as opposed to just ensuring that you've got somebody monitoring to an independent monitor to ensure that things are fair and unbiased.
Mr. Phillips, this is Arthur O'Donnell. Just a follow-up question on that. In our construct, because we're tying procurement to the IRP process, one of the basic functions that a monitor would provide is to ensure conformance with the decision that comes out of the IRP in terms of the action plan, right? So it's not specifying or making recommendations on particular resources. It's just ensuring that the solicitation and the market procurement is aligned with the decision that came out of the statement of need and the action plan. Does PNM see any problem with that in terms of concerns about substitution of judgment?
No, I think that would come through standard practices. If there's a defined statement of need that goes into the action plan, that should be transmitted into the RFP instructions. And presumably the independent monitor would be given a copy of the RFP instructions prior to those being sent out to market to then solicit bids. So I think that is well in scope of what we would expect an independent monitor to do. And I also think, going back to my previous comments, the independent monitor should have enough technical expertise to review all of the materials that are being done throughout the entire evaluation process. I just think it needs to stop short of them doing a parallel evaluation, running their own software or anything like that, and coming up with specific recommendations. It should be to ensure that the process is clearly defined through the RFP instructions, and that all of the questions and answers are done appropriately, that the evaluation is fair and unbiased, and leads to an outcome as was originally intended through the instructions themselves.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. And Ms. Padilla, you said that you would oppose a circumstance in which the independent monitor is acting essentially, not to put words in your mouth, but as an agent of the commission. So am I correct in assuming that the utility would be the entity that identifies and contracts with the independent evaluator or monitor, not the commission, under your preferred scenario?
Yes, Mr. O'Donnell, I believe that is the way we framed it in our proposed changes to the commission's rule in the earlier procurement docket. So yes.
Well, that is consistent with the way that most states do it, except for Massachusetts and I think Oklahoma. So thank you.
Okay.
Anybody else? Anybody else out there have a comment on it? Any other utility representatives or parties that might be involved in solicitations?
It looks like Nancy would like to speak from El Paso Electric.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nancy Burns with El Paso Electric Company. It's nice to see everyone and hear everyone this morning. I have Omar Gallegos with me, and he is a resource planning director for EPE, similar to Nick Phillips' job. The only thing I just want to add, I know we don't have tons of time this morning, you know, the independent evaluator section of the rule was very, very short in this current draft. So I think it would be good if we are going to develop an independent evaluator provision or a separate rule, that we would take more time to work on it. I personally have not gone back right now. I'm not prepared to address prior comments that were in the 1830 case. But, you know, Art O'Donnell, I would like to say that EPE does use Merrimack, Wayne Oliver in, you know, for the last several years in our all source procurements before the commission. We use him as an independent evaluator along the terms described by Mr. Phillips in our resource procurements, recent resource procurements that have been, you know, brought to the commission. I don't really see anything that EPE does as inconsistent with the draft paragraph 14, except that it says, you know, that the commission may assign. That just sort of calls into question the idea that you were just talking with Ms. Padilla about. I think we would probably prefer to keep it a utility selected process. But if it were to go into a different process, I think, you know,
Nancy, you cut out for a second.
can you hear me now?
Yeah, at least at first you said if it were to go into a different process.
And if you can hear me now, if Mr. Gallegos has a few things to add, that would be all.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, and as Nancy mentioned, we have used Merrimack for the majority of our all source RFP solicitations in recent acquisitions. Similar, we do refer to Mr. Oliver as independent evaluator, Merrimack Energy as independent evaluator, but they do stop short of actual running modeling for the resource selection, right? But they do provide kind of oversight. We typically do utilize them from fairly early on in the stages in the development of our RFP and the evaluation criteria. One thing, and I think this might be what Nancy was referring to in terms of if we prefer it to be a utility selected independent evaluator only because of the amount of complexity that is involved in modeling reliability and understanding NERC requirements and how the different type of resources behave. And so if there were any effort to have pre-selected independent evaluators or monitors, just really that it goes beyond just a typical monitor of a typical solicitation, because there is a lot of modeling assumptions that have to be made, and you would require someone with the right type of industry experience to be able to ascertain if those modeling assumptions and analysis are appropriate for the decision making, because I think to someone that is not experienced, they may just view that as a way of biasing the selection process. So that is very important, and when you look at individuals such as Merrimack, that as you mentioned, Mr. O'Donnell, that utilized in many different states. I believe they are independent evaluators for different states. They have that type of experience and breadth of knowledge.
Right. They are not the only one that's out there, although one gets that impression when you go on the internet because they're so involved. And certainly the commission would not be hiring cyber ninjas to do this kind of evaluation. It is suggested in some other states that the commission come up with a list of approved independent evaluators. I didn't see a need to go into detail on that, but do you have any thoughts on the value of such a thing? Or do you think that the utilities really have the information that they need in order to make a good selection?
I mean, I believe, utilities have access to the information we need to make a good selection. At least in the case of, as EPE, as you mentioned, Merrimack may not be the only one out there, but recognizing the experience and participation in different states, that's how we would be able to vet out, utilizing anyone else, right, in terms of their experience. And I think that there may be concern about, the utility selecting these independent evaluators, but in reality, I mean, these individuals have, their reputation underlined in terms of, providing an independent assessment and report, as what Merrimack has done for us when we submit our, any of our filings. They generate an independent, report of their assessment. So I think that the information is out there to assess who's competent and who has the experience to be an independent monitor or evaluator.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ms. Burns, Mr. Gallegos, and everybody else. We're running a little bit late right now on our schedule, but I will open it if anybody else has something to say. Yeah, Judith.
I had two people contact me, Lisa Tormion Hickey and Joan Drake. But before we go to Lisa, I had a comment that Nancy Burns and Mr. Gallegos were using the word independent evaluator, and Ms. Padilla and PNM specifically preferred the term monitor. And I'm just wondering what EPE's position is regarding that term, evaluator or monitor.
I think, well, from my perspective, would be just the proper definitions of, of what the role of that independent evaluator monitor would be, right? I think that what Merrimack has provided for EPE, maybe falls in line with the terms that Nick Phillips describes as an independent monitor. They stop short of actually running modeling evaluations for the purposes of performing their own selection process. So, I think it's just more about the proper definition in terms. I would agree that, we're not looking for an independent evaluator to go to the full step of performing a full selection process, doing their own modeling to then select resources, but rather, provide some oversight to the utilities process. So I think it might be, Mr. O'Donnell mentioned that it appears to be a term that's used, those two terms may be used indifferently, but I think it really comes down to defining the proper scope. And in that regard, I would agree with Mr. Phillips that it stops short of actual performing modeling and a full selection process on their own.
So yeah, it sounds like the critical distinction I'm hearing is the person, what they do is really overseeing and not running their own modeling. That seems to be the distinction.
Correct.
That I'm hearing from PM and PE. Okay, that being said, Lisa Tormion Hickey represents Inner West Energy Alliance and has a comment.
Thank you very much. Mr. O'Donnell's presentation was very good. I think you see that it's accurate based on my experience working with Interwest Energy Alliance in 6 states, including Utah and Colorado. Utah seems to have a stringent process, which New Mexico doesn't need to follow in detail, but could use some important parts of. I think an independent evaluator can be very useful to make sure that the RFP that's proposed and should be approved by the commission comports with and is of sufficient detail to implement the order from the commission coming out of the IRP process. The RFP also provides important predictability to bidders so that they know what the utility is really looking for. And so I think that can be very helpful to provide transparency, as is important to New Mexico, as well as predictability. And that saves costs, it reduces risks, and makes sure the utility really fills its need. But it also makes sure that the public policies from New Mexico are implemented in this process so that resource selection is based on economic factors. And an IE can provide a very thorough report, I think, without running its modeling, so long as the scope of work is detailed enough to allow it to really follow and track what the utility has done. I've seen some of the reports come out afterwards to be very helpful to say, this bid review factor was weak because of XYZ, or they can highlight important areas where transmission interconnection bollocks up the bid review process. And that can be critical and hard to solve, frankly, for utility and bidders, but certainly is critical for the commission to be aware of and to be able to address where it can. So I think at the beginning of the end is a very important place for the independent evaluator to be useful to the commission. Otherwise, I generally agree with Mr. Gallegos. I think about the scope of work is what's critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. I believe I had a message from Joan Drake that Joan Drake wanted to comment.
He may have had to drop off, and so we're sort of tag teaming here today, and we appreciate the opportunity to follow up on our comments in the 30 docket last year.
Okay, thank you very much. Then I will go to Commissioner Hall, who wanted to make a comment. Commissioner Hall.
Yes, Judy, I thought there was someone else.
That was Joan Drake, but she is working with Lisa, so Lisa made the comment.
And I thought I saw Anastasia Stevens had her hand up.
Yeah, I asked her if she wanted to comment, but she hasn't answered. Anastasia Stevens, would you like to comment?
Hi, Judy. Yes, I would. I did send a message. I think you may have gotten it just now. Actually, my comment is a question for Nancy and Omar, because Nancy's smiling there, because I guess the question here is that during the last resource acquisition cases, as Omar said, EPE used Wayne Oliver as the independent evaluator. And now we're in the course of near the end of the next IRP cycle, and they're using a different consultant, E3, to help with the IRP process. And my question is, and this is specifically to EP, but also to the other utilities, do you see different harder lines being drawn between the roles of outside consultants if this rule or a rule where the commission has a role in selecting the IE goes into effect?
I'm sorry, Anastasia, I don't really understand the question about hard lines between consultants if the rule goes into effect.
Well, for example, would for the upcoming situation, do you see Wayne Oliver or Mary Mac coming in after everything is done and the IRP is approved, or and you're moving? I mean, is it a clear cutoffs in the process from IRP approval or IRP filing to procurement process, and never the twain shall meet?
Yeah, I know. I think that in itself is a really good question, and it tees off of some of the discussion we're having about the role of an independent evaluator. And I just want to make it really clear that it's EBE's position that the role of the independent evaluator, and this goes along with the comments I'm not doing the modeling, the role of the independent evaluator, as we have used an independent evaluator and see it and foresee it in the future, is to ensure that the solicitation process itself. No, are you shaking your head at me, Commissioner Fishman? Are you just stretching your neck?
Yeah, I think it looks like he's stretching his neck. But
sometimes you can't hear me because I'm off. So
right.
But anyway, that the role of independent evaluator is not to ensure compliance with a prior commission order on an IRP. I think that was the characterization of Mr. O'Donnell, but it's to ensure that the solicitation process itself is.
Now you froze, Nancy.
I'm sorry.
There you are.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I guess I should call in. So there is really no overlap in the roles of those different consultants. The independent monitor, the independent monitor helps with the solicitation, the RFP, the selection of resources, not with the IRP itself.
Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, no, we can talk more about it.
So I believe Commissioner Hall and Commissioner Fishman would like both to make comments. And Commissioner Hall, can you go first?
Sure. Yeah, I was just wondering about the activities of an independent monitor or evaluator, whatever you want to call it, especially if they are working with the utility. And I can understand the utility's leeriness about them, about the evaluator coming up with, doing their own evaluation and coming up with alternatives. But I was curious, what about in instances, if it has ever happened, wherein the evaluator has, a concept of another evaluation to perform, doesn't perform it themselves, but, either suggests it to the utility or suggests it to the commission, or both, maybe both would be the appropriate thing. Does that ever happen? And whether or not it's ever happened, is that something that you would consider useful? And of course, I guess whether or not the scope of work would contemplate something like that would be important, but I just wanted to toss that out there as a question. So this question, I guess, is for Nancy and Omar and Nick and whatever other utility representatives are on the call.
Right.
Well, I see that Omar would like to respond.
Yes. So when we work with an independent evaluator such as Merrimack, you know, we do have dialogue of how, you know, the RFP narrative and how we'll go through the selection process. And so,
Omar, 1 second. If you could just talk a little louder or slower, one or the other at least would be
okay,
helpful for me.
sure.
Okay.
Is this better?
Yeah, that's a lot better. Just getting closer to the microphone, I guess,
All
is
right.
what you did.
Yeah. So yeah, when we work with the independent evaluator with Merrimack, you know, we do review with them the narrative of the RFP that's going to go out and the baselines and also, you know, if they were to raise a concern, you know, you know, none come to mind, right? But if an independent evaluator were to raise a concern that, you know, the way we're going about something, you know, may lead to bias interpretation, or, you know, if they were to share information of how others may have gone through comparable evaluations, we would take that into consideration in our process. But I think it stops short of them, you know, actually running the modeling process. You know, not all independent evaluators or monitors would be, you know, have that modeling capability. They're really more maintaining of pulse of the industry and what has been common and what may be done in other jurisdictions as they work in different jurisdictions for different customers.
Well, I wasn't really asking about whether or not they'd raise a concern so much as just have productive idea of an alternative or something, which I suppose would arise from their knowledge of other cases or whatever. But you know, just something that presumably adds value, but isn't necessarily in the nature of a criticism of what is being proposed. It's just an alternative idea. Does that ever happen?
But Commissioner Hall, what do you mean by alternative? It's kind of a general term. I'm not sure it's real clear.
Well, it's probably not. You're right. It is a general term.
Alternative what?
I guess an alternative approach to, or maybe an enhancement of whatever the utilities approach is for any aspect of the procurement, you know. In other words, something that would vary from, I guess by alternative, I mean something that would vary from what the utility is proposing. But rather than do independent evaluation on their own, they don't do that, but then they just get a bright idea, you know, some idea that may be helpful. How is that dealt with? Does that ever happen?
I mean, I don't, it doesn't come to my mind where anything like that has occurred in terms of a major difference in approach or alternative of how to evaluate. You know, the majority of the process is fairly comprehensive already, right? But you know, I would, you know, if that were to occur in the future, then, you know, it'd be a discussion with the independent evaluator on, and then the utility would make a decision on if to incorporate or evaluate that alternative.
This is Nick.
Okay.
Add to that.
Say that, Nikki.
Yes, please, Mr. Phillips from P&M would like to add something.
Thank you very much. I guess I'm agreeing with Omar. The way I would see it is if the independent evaluator had some type of thought that, you know, they had an idea that wasn't being considered, that was in line with the RFP instructions, they would raise that as a concern to the utility, and the utility would take that concern back and decide, you know, how they want to approach it. It wouldn't necessarily be where you get to the end of the process and the resources are selected, and then the independent evaluator says, well, wait a second, these resources aren't necessarily meeting the requirements because they've been in line all along guiding the process to make sure the requirements are met, and they're during the fair and biased process. I think maybe what is being thought about is, if we take the San Juan abandonment case as an example, the CCAE alternative that was not proposed by the utility was put out by some stakeholders. And should that interpretation of how to interpret the EPA, if the independent evaluator came up with something like that, is that something that they would be proposing then to the utility, saying, go back and run your models in this sense? And so perhaps the way that would be taken care of is either through the typical stakeholder process, or if, depending on who the independent evaluator is reporting to, say they have a direct line with PRC staff, and we've already talked a little bit earlier about how there needs to be a process to ensure that stakeholders have the ability to suggest modeling alternatives. The staff may then take the independent evaluator's idea and offer that as something that they would like to see as an alternative as well. So I think that there's ways that could be done, but I don't think it's necessarily the role of the independent evaluator, independent monitor per se, because their role really should be confined to, are we evaluating in a fair and unbiased manner consistent with the RFP instructions, which in turn should be aligned with the action plan coming out of the IRP.
Well, thank you, Mr. Phillips. That's really good. That kind of goes to I think the reason I thought of the question was, I mean, it would be a bit of a departure from the role, and so so your concept there of maybe handing the idea to staff or something would work, or maybe just, maybe they just really shouldn't be offering ideas. I don't know, but it just crossed my mind that probably an evaluator looking at things like this would probably, how could his or her mind not, reflect on other scenarios. But anyhow, I appreciate the answers. Thanks, folks.
Yes, and I know Commissioner Fishman had a comment, and then I think since we're behind schedule, after Commissioner Fishman, we'll take a 15-minute break and come back. But go ahead, Commissioner Fishman.
Yeah, just I guess two issues that I'd love people to, everybody here, to develop positions on that are really important, at least in my thinking. One is the one that was just covered. The independent monitor, should they just be reviewing the fairness of the process, or should they be making recommendations? I have a concern that if they're making recommendations, that now they've got a position they're defending, and it might make their review of the process and its fairness less objective. But that's just, one thought there. I'm also concerned that if they're injecting their opinions on solutions, it becomes like another party almost in the proceeding. That's really not a stakeholder with, the lawyers will beat me up for using this term improperly, but someone with the position who doesn't have standing. So you guys can beat me up for using that word improperly later on. But so I do have concerns about that, and I'd love to hear people's opinions on it. The second area is in terms of who this person reports to. And a comment was made that it wouldn't be as objective if they reported to the commission. And I kind of, I had a big question mark go into my head, because everybody else who's involved is a stakeholder with a position to protect, and theoretically the commission puts all that together to, come up with a solution that best serves everyone's needs. And I can't think of a more objective place for that monitor to report. And again, I may be missing something there, but I think this issue of who the monitor reports to is critical. And right now, my bias is, oh, it should report to the commission, but I think everybody should develop their thoughts on that as thoroughly as possible as we go forward. As Arthur pointed out, most jurisdictions do let the utility hire that person. I think we have to give that careful thought as we're looking at this rule.
Well, my only comment too is, in the energy efficiency rule, there is an independent, I'm not sure if it's called monitor or evaluator, but it's possible to model it after that process, since that's already established. And I believe that in that case, it's paid for by the utility, and I'm not sure exactly who they report to, or I'd have to research it. I used to know.
That's it for me.
Okay.
And by the way, Nancy, I was just getting the cricks out of my neck. I wasn't just dumping on you. If I ever just dump on you, I'll be really straightforward about it. I'll just preface everything with, Nancy, I'm dumping on you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
All right, well, let's take a 15-minute break to 11:45. We'll come back with comments and questions on the presentations. I think we have done the independent monitor, so.
Judy?
Yes.
Judy, did you say 11:35? Because my computer tells me it's 11:28 right now. That's not 15
No, I
minutes.
was thinking 11:45, 45.
Okay.
And we can come back with questions on items besides the independent monitor, although I won't, if somebody really has a burning desire to say something about the independent monitor, they can. But that being said, maybe comments about the other presentations. 11:45.
Thanks.
Well, hello, everyone. I see it's 11:46, and we are back again for any additional comments or questions. I have a list of participants, and I can go through the list. So that could be the, now I can't get to my list, but, oh, my computer is being very, very slow. Okay, got it. Well, my list doesn't want to open up, but I will, oh, there it is. Okay. I will go to staff first. I have John Reynolds and David Black signed up. Would staff like to make any comments? Would John Reynolds or David Black like to make any comments? All right, hearing none, if they come back, I have 3 participants from SPS Excel: Kyle Reddle, Will Du Bois, and Ben Elzy. Would either or would any of SPS's participants like to make a comment? I think I see Will, and I think he's muted. Can anyone hear Will?
No, I wasn't able to.
Will, we can't hear you. Would anyone else from SPL? Oh, that's good. Okay, now we can hear you.
Work?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Amer, Will Du Bois for SPS, and thank you all. Thank you to the commission and folks for pulling this together. Kind of wanted to start very big picture with something we're trying to get our minds around, which is, I think where we started on this was seeing the objectives and including the objective of trying to ensure just and reasonable and good rates for customers and ensuring stability and reliability at the same time, which is a set of objectives we absolutely share, but then seeing the text of the rule and trying to infer from that how or what the major objectives for the commission and how to get there were. And in looking at that, just thinking about the IRP component in isolation for a moment, we're looking at whether the purpose and goal of the IRP are to use that as a mechanism for the utility to communicate to the commission, to customers, to the public, how and whether it's going about its work of ensuring safety, reliability, and just and reasonable rates, or whether the goal is to lock the utility and its management into a particular path on how to do that for some period of time, whether it's 3 or 4 years or what. And if it's the latter, then whether it's a method of utility management, bringing something forward that's subject to comment and input and then becomes what locks the utility in, or whether the goal is to have something that the commission then dictates what the utilities path will be for the next period of time. And so that's kind of a series of questions that it looks like, or at least it looked like in the initial draft, it was that last path of the commission locking the utility into a path. And it's a little bit more ambiguous, at least to me from this discussion, where we're trying to head on that. But I think from SPS's perspective, the draft rules seem to communicate that the commission felt that there is something wrong with the combination of the CCN process, the PPA process, and the IRP. And SPS has used, I think, all of these things, we believe, pretty well. We have a number of PPA commitments which have been approved by the commission. We have used CCNs with utility self-build, but we have a very large batch of approved PPAs and a lot of PPA obligations. And thinking about the multi-jurisdictional angle on this, Mr. Lundy, to your questions and comments, I think it's a much longer discussion, but I'd point just as an illustration of what we're talking about to SPS's experience with a couple of sizable solar PPAs. SPS did a competitive procurement, and that competitive procurement yielded a pair of projects, solar projects located in New Mexico. SPS received New Mexico approval through the PPA rule for those. On the Texas side, there is no resource planning process, and in general, there's no opportunity to get pre-approval for a PPA. You enter into a PPA and go forward with it at risk. Fast forward, Texas didn't like the solar PPAs, was not satisfied with New Mexico's process, and for whatever reason, rejected and disallowed the PPAs. SPS came back to New Mexico with that Texas portion and offered to use it for New Mexico and New Mexico customers, and the New Mexico Commission rejected that. And so while we have other issues like figuring out how to proceed relative to the Southwest Power Pool and other matters, that does kind of crystallize and exemplify some of the challenges that we see with a prescriptive process, and particularly one that covers both jurisdictions, or that sets the course for SPS in a way that covers both jurisdictions. I don't want to occupy too much of the time that we do have, but a couple other things I wanted to touch on. One, since I didn't address the independent entity discussion, I would actually, I think, echo some of Commissioner Fishman's comments. And along with that, I'm not sure that we have an opinion or have thought about the idea of the independent entity being biased by having a relationship directly to the commission. But we do have a concern about whether there's a risk that the independent entity could, just by the process, inherently bias the commission. It would be somebody who the commission has, on the model where the commission has retained the independent entity, that necessarily creates a level of investment upfront with the independent entity. And there could also be concerns about the independent entity not being subject to ex parte rules within these processes, having other public information or IPRA and procedural issues where they're essentially reviewing evidence and coming to conclusions about it outside of the commission's processes and rules of evidence. So that goes to a set of concerns we have there. And we believe that whatever label you put on it, having somebody who helps ensure a fair and unbiased process, I think, is where we were all starting from thinking about this. And I think it makes sense to think about what the appropriate way of dealing with that is. And I think if you're going to put labels on it, we'd probably be looking more at a independent monitor label, but the devil's in the details on what the role really is. One other thing, I think the last thing I'll touch on, unless there are questions, is there was discussion about, for example, the takings issue, and I'm just pulling that out as an example. But the discussion in the early going here was encouraging, but then when we go to what was still in the redlined rule, for example, in 12J, it looks like we still functionally have the same issue, even though part of the provision was cut. So, again, going back to my initial comments, it would be helpful, I think, to have a discussion on the what and how and why of what we're trying to get to that would, at least for SPS's part, help us provide more constructive comments than when we're in the mode of trying to work back to that from what's in the draft and comment on the draft, and not necessarily interpreting things correctly or being on the same page as where the commission wants to be. So probably gone on long enough for the time we have, and thank you for the opportunity to address this.
Thank you. Well, next I would like to go to a representative from PNM. It looks like I have several people: Leslie D. and Nick Phillips, Michael Keegan, Andrea Contreras, and Frank Andazola. Any comments from PNM?
You're on mute, Leslie.
Oh, sorry, I started my video, but not my audio.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Amer, I believe the folks from PNM on the call are Steve Schwebke, Nick Phillips, and Michael Keegan. I wanted to respond briefly. Michael Keegan actually is outside counsel for PNM, would like to speak a little bit about the different adjudication processes that are in the rule, and maybe how the Colorado rules and procedures may help us understand what the New Mexico proposed rule may mean for New Mexico. But before he does that, I wanted to talk briefly about the Commission's authority, responding to your presentation, Judy. And I know we're supposed to provide constructive feedback, so this may not be very constructive, because I mean, my response is that PNM still questions the Commission's authority. And if it's, we think at best, the Commission may have authority to issue a procurement rule. And it's something that I'd like an opportunity to probably submit more written comments on. But I would note that the 1987 Supreme Court case that was cited in Ms. Amer's presentation, that rests on a very specific statute that authorizes the Commission to look at Class 2 transactions. So the question in that case was whether that statute that said the Commission may investigate Class 2 transactions, and I'm probably not getting the words exactly right, applied to the PNM application in that case. That case really wouldn't apply here because there is no specific statute saying the Commission may regulate procurement. So I think that's a big distinction. I think, as at least all the attorneys know on the call, the PRC's authority derives exclusively from legislation. The Constitution itself simply creates the commission, but all authority is derived from legislation. I think the discussions in the several statutes that Ms. Amer mentioned, the energy efficiency statute, the RPS statute that mention competition, I'm not sure it's fair to read those to authorize the commission to regulate procurement to ensure competitive outcomes. I think it's probably more fair to read those as impositions on the utilities, which I would agree that they are, but whether those actually can be turned into specific delegations of authority to the commission to regulate procurement to the end of getting a competitive result is a different question, and I'm not sure that those provisions apply. And if they were to apply, I actually think one way they might apply is to as statements of what a competitive procurement rule should be limited to, because the energy efficiency statute obviously is limited to energy efficiency programs and demand response programs. The RPS similarly, to renewable resources. So that goes to one of the issues that we've made in the recommendations that we've made in our comments, that the scope of this rule, that is the types of procurements that the rule apply to, be clearly stated and limited. That's all I have, and I would like to ask Michael Keegan to make some brief remarks also.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Ms. Padilla, and good afternoon, commissioners, and Ms. Amer. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. As Ms. Padilla mentioned, I'm going to address some concerns regarding procedural aspects of the proposed rule, particularly related to the first procedural portion related to the stakeholder process, statement of need, and the action plan. And one of the concerns that PNM has is that the proposed rule states that the case would be submitted to adjudication by the commission if there isn't agreement between the utility and the stakeholders. And I think that PNM is concerned with a couple of aspects. First is that the lack of agreement is not clear, which it might suggest that if there isn't unanimity, that means there's no agreement, and that there's probably a strong likelihood that there might not be unanimity, and therefore the case would almost always be submitted to commission adjudication. And while PNM is supportive of the idea that this could be a streamlined process, the rule itself does not set forth what that process would be. It just says that it would be submitted to the commission for adjudication. And while the commission does have rules regarding applications, it's not clear whether this would be an application or some sort of request for approval. And so that's another concern that PNM has, because it's not clear what the commission's avenue for hearing this case and considering this case would be, particularly since what is now proposed paragraph D of section 9 states that the commission would either deny or approve, deny, or modify and approve the proposed statement of need and action plan. And because there's the potential for denial or modification of what would be proposed by the utility, there has to be enough evidence in the record for the commission to make a decision, particularly if the application would be denied or modified. And so PNM is concerned that the actual procedures have not been carefully considered for the commission to get to an adjudication on the merits. And so one of the things that I wanted to discuss was just a quick comparison to the Colorado process, because it does appear that the Colorado rules have formed somewhat of a, the inspiration for some of the rules that are in the proposed rule. And also just to allude to the fact that I think in the first workshop, Commissioner Hall had mentioned that she might be interested in a future workshop with receiving input from either former or current commissioners in other states to see how their processes work. In the sense, the Colorado process is currently different from the current New Mexico process, but may have some similarities to some of the proposed rules. Under the Colorado rules, the application for an electric resource plan is a typical administrative litigation process, and some of the recent processes by the Colorado utilities have taken upwards of 10, 11, nearly 12 months to come to an adjudication. The utility files their IRP application supported by multiple pieces of testimony. Interveners, stakeholders are given the opportunity for answer testimony. There's followed by rebuttal and cross-answer testimony, public comments, an evidentiary hearing, post-hearing briefs, commissioner deliberation, of course, and then written decisions. And of course, the written decision is subject to application for rehearing. And so the company is just concerned that while the proposed rule seems to contemplate a streamlined process, it's not clear that to get to an actual adjudication, it's possible to have a very short process. And the company is concerned that, you know, the utilities, the stakeholders, and the commission itself will be expending an awful lot of resources. And finally, at the end of that, it's not clear what the result actually is. The company is also concerned about the language concerning the rebuttable presumption. The term rebuttable presumption is in the title of Rule, I think, 13, but the language itself is actually unclear. It's unclear that the utilities would actually, that their actions would actually be presumed prudent in the subsequent applications that are submitted as a follow-on to the IRP process.
Is that the end of your comment?
Yes, sorry. that concludes my my comments there.
Okay. Then with that, we will go next to EPE. I have Nancy Burns, Curtis Hutchinson, Omar Gallegos, and Roberto Favela.
Yeah, hello again. EP doesn't really have any prepared comments for this workshop, but you know, I would, and we do have questions about the rule itself, and I'm not certain, you know, given the time, if there's enough time to go into all of these questions. Am I fading out again?
No, I can hear you.
Okay. You know, I have a lot of questions about the scope of the rule. I think a lot of the rule changes that Mr. Gillespie went over and Ms. Amer, I think a lot of it, you know, is helpful, but I still have a lot of unanswered questions. Like just one question is it intended for this rule to apply to all utility resource procurements? That it seems to be the scope.
The scope. Oh, I see. So are you saying, is it limited to just procurements?
Well, for example, Judy, we had proposed in the scope an exclusion for emergency procurements. And so maybe it's envisioned that every time the utility has an emergency procurement, they come in and get a variance from the rule. I just don't know. It seems by not including that, you know, there would be no emergency procurements. You know, it seems to me by the way the rule is scoped, take, for example, you know, EP hasn't done this, but, you know, SPS had some bilaterally agreed to wind facilities. I think there was several of them, 3 or 4, that the commission approved. So is the way the rule's written envisioned that every time the utility wants to engage in a procurement for any purpose, a resource procurement for any purpose, you come in and get a variance from the rule? That's just a question that I have. And it really goes to Mr. Lundine's, questions regarding multi-jurisdictional utility planning. Conversation about the impact on multi-jurisdictional utilities of having a very prescriptive rule in one jurisdiction for how to go about utility procurement. Because those procurements that are prescribed in one jurisdiction, they're not necessarily going to be looked favorably in the other jurisdiction.
Well, I think, your questions and concerns are something that we need to consider. And I don't know if anyone wants to comment at this point, or whether we will go back and meet as a group on it. Yes, Commissioner Hall.
Well, one thing that was crossing my mind as I was listening to Nancy and Mr. Keegan and Mr. Dubois was that, maybe that we need to expand our process a little bit to include working groups, similar to what we do in the interconnection rulemaking process, because, these are some challenging issues that we know we haven't figured out. And if you guys think our language isn't clear, it's because we're not clear. And these areas you picked several areas where I think we do need help from you guys insofar as we need to sit down and really talk through, the minutia of problems that I don't mean that they're small problems, but I mean the numerous types of problems that can arise, and there are many of them. So, and to see what kind of, solutions we can come up with that would be mutually agreeable, if any. So I'm just tossing that out there as an idea to maybe amplify our process a little bit with the opportunity to have some working groups that are not quite as formal as these workshops and are more focused. They don't have to include the entire group of people, but we have a smaller group of people dedicated to specific issues who are going to try to work through them in more detail and then bring it back to the larger group. I don't know if anybody wants to devote that much time to this process, but it does take some time. And I guess it depends on how intractable you think our relative positions are. But to the extent you're finding our language just unclear and don't understand what we're saying, I mean, certainly you would think that we could maybe make some progress on language clarity and then determine whether or not this is something that would be, this kind of process might be a contribution or not. So I don't know if anybody has any reaction to that concept, but please feel free to say something.
Just, we can come back, I suppose, to the idea of working groups. But at this point, I think I'll just run through the list. Central Valley Electric Cooperative. Would you like to make a comment? Raylan Bean. I don't know if Raylan is still present. If not, I would.
Judy, excuse me, I'm sorry. I noticed Anastasia has her hand up again. We can go to Anastasia, and I was actually going to get to her, but if she would like to comment now, go ahead, Anastasia.
Hi, everybody. No, I was last to the party here, I think, and was hoping that Judy would go through her list of people who asked previously. But I do have a couple of questions and comments, some of which mostly they overlap with Mr. Keegan's comments about the procedures for approvals.
You know what, Anastasia, it's absolutely fine for you to go at this point, and then I can just go back to the list. So why don't you, take it away.
Okay, well, on the subject of the procedures, from the opposite standpoint, the consumer standpoint, it's always odd when you find yourself agreeing with the utility, but as representing City of Las Cruces and having to put a lot of effort into cases, it would be infinitely helpful for it to be clear what the adjudication process is and what triggers it, because as the rule now reads, at least the way I'm reading it now, it says that there will be an adjudication process undefined if there's no agreement. But whether that means that the commission rubber stamp, how the process goes, even if there is no agreement, how you get to a determination that there's no disagreement until you do a process is sort of circular. You can't just have the utility say, oh, we did this public advisory process and everything's hunky-dory, so give us the gold star. And I don't want to be cynical, but there are going to, I think that given the amount of material that goes into an IRP, as long as there's even a rebuttable presumption, it's going to be very difficult to get to a situation in which there aren't some disagreements. And for example, I think this is a safe one to use because it's been bouncing around in the El Paso electric world for a long time, is that even if the parties were informed and satisfied with the selection process and the modeling, there are major underlying problems that I'm not going to go into deeply about the question of a retirement, existing plant retirement as a predicate for the need for additional capacity. And it's going to be difficult, I think, to do the ins and the outs, the pluses and the minuses, and have everybody happy without the commission making some determinations that are formal. And of course, abandonment retirement is a statutory thing. So that's something you're going to have to do, the commission is going to have to decide at some point in time. But to the extent that a utility can say, I guess the question is, to what extent does a utility have to, as part of the IRP process, justify its anticipated retirement date, and then go from there as determining what the need is and what the best choices are to fill the need. Load growth is easier than retirements in a lot of ways. And in conjunction with that concern, I will say that I probably was discussed at the first workshop, but I don't recall why the time frame, the planning period, is now 10 years instead of 20 or a little more than 20 to get us out through the 2045 of the Renewable Energy Act. It seems like, given that long-term resources have lives more than 10 years, that a longer time frame is probably still appropriate as it's been under the rule previously. I mean, maybe there's a way to look at that in two phases and assess both the shorter term and the longer term. But in the big picture, I think almost everybody is looking at, until the Renewable Energy Act is modified, I think everybody's got to be looking towards how you take that flow path that the legislature has now established, and taking too small a piece of that might cut off what we really need, which is integrated resource planning that gets us to that point in 2045 or 2047, and not something that puts the blinders on and looks in the nearer term. And my last comment or question is as far as the multi-jurisdictional issue. I mean, I understand it's an issue. However, there's been an IRP process and a rule, IRP rule changes a bit for more than a decade now. So it seems not entirely forthcoming for the utilities, the EPE and SPS to, at this point in time, be a rule on IRP because substance of what you're doing is not terrifically different, except I think for the RFP provisions. So if that's their problem, I think they should speak up and say that's their problem. Our problem is more with the question of how many times we're going to litigate things and what will happen if we don't litigate them over and over again, and there's a rebuttable presumption relating to any aspect of the plan. Of that, thank you for hearing me.
Judy, may I
Yes,
interject for just a second?
certainly.
On the specific issue of the 10 versus 20 years, I thought we discussed that and that we were going back to 20 years, but maybe I jumped to a conclusion there. Where did we stand? And Colin, you may be able to comment on this as well.
I'm sorry, Commissioner, I was taking a note. What's the question?
So I thought Anastasia, Miss Stevens, excuse me, had raised the issue of 20 years versus 10 years for the
Yes.
IRP time horizon. I recall that we'd had some discussion around that, and I thought we decided to go back to 20 years, but maybe I misinterpreted. So I just wondered if you guys could comment on that.
I can handle that. Yes. So we did have some discussions, and I think that we did agree to go back to a 20-year planning horizon. And I want to verify that that actually made it into this this updated proposal of the draft rule. But if it didn't, then that would be a failure on my part, as we definitely discussed this internally and agreed that the planning horizon does need to be longer, although there is also some utility in shortening some type of outlook just due to the rapid technological advancements that the landscape is experiencing at this point. So I see under definition U here that under this most recent proposal, it is still 10 years. And I would offer to Ms. Stevens and the other parties that we'll have another discussion about that. And I apologize for personally not translating our discussion into that part of the rule here.
Not an issue. I just, I think it's a valid point, and I wanted to save other people the trouble of having to bring it up.
Yes, Commissioner. I believe that Patrick O'Connell also had some concerns about that planning horizon, and we definitely had internal discussions on that, sir. Thank you.
Thanks.
And then with that, I've been informed that staff is present with Jack Sidler and Eli. Would either one of them like to make a comment? Jack Sidler or Eli LaSalle?
I don't have any current comments. This is the first meeting that I've attended on this, and I've been watching, but I'm still relatively new to this and would leave it mostly to the more experienced people present.
Okay, and Jack, do you have any comments?
Yeah, sorry. I was listening, but not sitting right at the computer. No, staff doesn't have any prepared comments and found it interesting to hear the comments of the various parties and utilities.
Okay. Thank you. And next I will go to, it seems like Raylan Bean from Central Valley isn't available. So I have the three people from the New Mexico Attorney General, Gideon Elliott, Kevin Gedko, and Sydney Wright. Would any one of them like to make a comment?
Hi there. Yeah, this is Kevin. I'm new to this particular process as well, but the one thing I've been thinking on a little bit is whether there are any processes, maybe Art would know, if other states typically have the utilities choosing the independent commissioner or evaluator or monitor. I guess I'm a little bit more skeptical than what I've heard as to the ability of that individual to remain independent. And I'm wondering if there are processes in other states where there is a review of the choice that's made or any kind of checks on that selection. And I gather that there's issues of when the commission gets involved in that, leading to an idea that they're directing something that should be still statutorily independent on the part of the utilities as far as their procurement goes. But that's a general question that's in my head that came out of the discussions that we had. And along with that, whether there's a review of the costs so that if this becomes a very large process, I'm sure it's small on the larger scale of overall costs, but it doesn't hurt to always be checking those numbers along the way to protect the rates of the consumers.
Yeah, Kevin, this is Arthur. Different states do it differently, and as was indicated that in some places, the selection of the independent evaluator or monitor is done conferring with the commission or commission staff or the attorney general or whoever's appropriate in that state. In other cases, it's purely on the utility selection. So it's really, different in different places. And so it would be up to New Mexico to decide what works for it if it goes down this path. And then I really did not see anything about determining the reasonableness of the cost of the independent evaluator. I can look further into that, but I just didn't see that as an issue that was raised in any of the documentation that I had.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the comment from the Attorney General's office. Next on my list is Brian Johnson from the New Mexico Renewable Energy Transmission Authority. I don't know if Brian is present. If not, Austin W. Jensen from the New Mexico Large Consumer Group. I see Austin.
Good afternoon, Ms. Amer. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. I just have a couple comments, and I understand we're at the end of our time, so I'll try to be brief. But I would echo Ms. Stevens' comments with regard to the multi-jurisdictional carve-out that the utilities have discussed today. I think a part of operating a multi-jurisdictional utility is the risk associated with multiple jurisdictions and competing interests in resource selection and procurement. I don't think that should be transformed into a carve-out for utilities to not have to comply with these IRP rules. So I know Mr. Du Bois had submitted a comment and would like to respond to this, but I would agree with Ms. Stevens on this point. With regard to emergency procurements, I had the same, I was interested in the utilities comments. It seemed like EP and PNM proposed similar carve-outs for emergency procurements. And reviewing the commission's proposed rules, there is some provisions in here about utility notification about material events that would affect the action plan or the IRP had those events been known at the time they were developed. I'd be curious to know from the commission what that notification, how that would, what form that notification would take, and whether that would operate as some sort of deviation from the action plan or IRP, and how that would work into any presumption of prudence that utilities are afforded in this process. I think that might be a way around emergency procurements if there is something that comes up that the utilities need to procure power. Obviously, that's a material event that wasn't known at the time the action plan or IRP was developed. So maybe that's an avenue to addressing those concerns. With regard to EPE's comments, I had a couple things I wanted to address. EPE proposed an addition to the rules that guaranteed utility recovery for costs of complying with these proposed rules. The New Mexico Large Customer Group would oppose that. Compliance with commission rules is something utilities do in their normal course of business. I fear reading this addition that EPE would request deferred accounting for these costs. In any rate case, compliance with commission rules and costs of proceedings should be normalized and recovered in base rates in the normal course of business. So I don't think that addition is necessary. Along the same lines, EPE proposed a conclusive prudence determination instead of a rebuttable presumption. I think that's inappropriate here to approve cost recovery of resources before any money is spent. I think when planning for resources and deciding the course that utilities should take, the extent of any presumption should be a rebuttable presumption that is evaluated after those monies are spent and the utilities have procured that resource. There's no way of determining prudence until after those investments have been made. And then the last thing is that I'll mention is in response to Mr. Gedko's comments, I too think that the commission should be involved somehow in determining who the independent evaluator or monitor, whatever form that takes. I think the commission should be involved in that process to inject some sort of impartiality. I share Commissioner Fishman's comments that the commission is the neutral arbiter in these proceedings over and above everyone else that participates. So having the commission involved in both the selection of the independent monitor, hence the name independent, by an independent party is crucial to ensuring impartiality in the process. And as far as who that person should report to, I think the commission is, again, the appropriate entity there. So with that is the comments I wanted to share and appreciate everyone listening.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Jensen. And I had a request from Will Du Bois to respond to Ms. Stevens on the multi-jurisdictional issue. So Will, please respond.
Thank you, Ms. Hamer. I am concerned with the characterization of it being a situation where this isn't a change from the status quo, and that there is, I guess, I'm not exactly sure what was meant by calling it disingenuous as a concern, but under the status quo, obviously, a multi-jurisdictional utility like SPS carries meaningful risk in both jurisdictions as to how it proceeds at the decision and direction of utility management. As I understand the structure of the rule we're talking about here, what we would be moving to is a situation where one jurisdiction could be essentially mandating a particular path. And from SPS's perspective, that is a meaningfully different issue, different question of authority, and has a meaningfully different impact. And it actually kind of flows right into the LCG comments on cost recovery, I think, because while obviously in its initial comments, SPS already took positions on authority issues and the substitution of judgment for utility, that of utility management, I think the cost recovery piece highlights it, because if the commission were to order a utility to set down a path on a particular resource, a particular PPA, et cetera, then it seems that prudence is, your utility management's prudence is out the window at that point, because the costs have been explicitly mandated. And so I think we, SPS, had similar comments to what was described about EPE in terms of moving beyond a rebuttable presumption or anything like that and going into it being dispositive or irrebuttable, because there is no utility management discretion to evaluate at that point. So again, thank you, Ms. Amer, for allowing me to come back to that.
Yes, I have a question though. You said something about the commission mandating particular procurements, and I really don't see that in the rule, and I don't quite understand that comment.
So, and this is something that I'm unclear on the current draft, but it seemed in the initial draft pretty clear that the IRP could be established, let's say, contrary to utility management's point of view, and adopt a different path. And while there have been changes, and I'm kind of unclear based on this morning's discussion, where exactly the current draft rule is intended to be on that, I'm not sure that it no longer says that there could be a decision on the IRP that's different from what the utility agreed with. And then if the RFPs run off of the IRP, and there's been a lot of discussion about having an independent entity essentially enforcing compliance with the IRP through the RFP processes, then that does seem like it would be locking in the utility management. And I would come back to I know this is always difficult for everyone to navigate multi-jurisdictional issues at times, but if one jurisdiction kind of puts itself in the shoes of the other, and if we think about from the New Mexico perspective what it would look like to have Texas having what it believed was a dispositive view on how to proceed, I think that probably would cause some concern on New Mexico end. And so that's part of what SPS is struggling with in thinking through what's been advanced so far and how to constructively respond to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would just at this point direct you to 17.7.3.10, and there's a new section C. And it says if the utility issues a request for proposal pursuant to 17.7.312 prior to a final order on the proposed statement of need, then no presumption of prudence shall apply in a subsequent case for cost recovery. I believe that that statement was inserted in there to try to make it clear that the utility could proceed, but it would be without the presumption.
Well, I would then have the question of, since this is framed as if a utility issues a request for proposals prior to a final order, then what happens if the utility issues an RFP after a final order? And that's where I was reading that it's still the IRP after a final order on the IRP still dictates the RFP path.
Then, no, it's after that, it says in 17.7.312, it says that the utility can issue RFPs following commission approval of the statement of need and action plan. And that then it goes through, a process regarding RFPs.
Judy, can I interject briefly?
Yes.
I believe also, Mr. Dubois, that in the cost recovery section that there is a rebuttable presumption if there are no material changes to the commission approved statement of need and action plan. So I think that that's where your question of what happens if the utility issues an RFP after the final order of the IRP, I would just direct you to that cost recovery section.
What number is that?
1 second here. That's going to be 177313.
And Ms. Amer, this is Leslie Padilla. I would like to make a brief comment on that. Mr. Keegan, in his comments on behalf of PNM, did raise this question about really the confusion of the current draft rule on this rebuttable presumption, because I don't read that last section that we were looking at, 13, as, while the title says rebuttable presumption, if you look at 13AC, I think the language there, evidence that the resource portfolio is consistent, I think that's kind of the same language as was in the IRP rule previously that the commission omitted. It just says it will constitute prima facie evidence, which may be rebutted by substantial evidence that the resource type is required by the public convenience and necessity. I still think there's some lack of clarity about what the current draft rule intends as to a rebuttable presumption. And then as in relation to Commissioner Hall's suggestion, this may be an area where it would be helpful to have a smaller working group perhaps, or or staff may want to take, not staff, but commission assistants may want to take an opportunity to further revise the rule based on both the discussion here and the comments that folks have already submitted in this proceeding.
And if I may tack on to that, I think this does, thank you. I think this does highlight the importance of what Commissioner Hall was describing a little bit ago. There's, I think, two levels to the conversation we're having, and one reflects a struggle with the draft, and as I described earlier, inferring back from that what we're trying to accomplish. And I think having a discussion that goes back to not whether the language accomplishes a particular goal, but what goal we're trying to accomplish per Commissioner Hall's comments could be a productive one, and at least highlight the issues.
Well, I think at the end we can discuss working groups. Is that okay, Commissioner Hall?
Yeah, I think we should. I think this is a good example of where one would be very useful. And I'd appreciate hearing from parties about whatever other areas you think a working group might bear fruit. we're here to make this happen, and we'd like to engage you in the most effective way for your purposes as well as ours as we can. So Leslie and Will, are you guys interested in starting a working group on that point? Or what that means is you'll be working, on your own schedule, not in the context of this larger group. You just pick a time to meet. And if you have other parties who want to meet with you, other members of this other stakeholders, I guess I should say, who want to work on it, they could join you as well. And you guys could work out some language.
Thank you, Commissioner Hall. I think for our part, we would be happy to engage on a process like that. But at the same time, I think it would be, if possible, helpful to have, at least for SPS's part, to have a better understanding of what within the existing combination of the IRP, CCN, EPA rules the Commission is feeling isn't serving customers in the public interest. And I know, from following Commission discussions and open meetings, there's been concern with possible.
You're breaking up quite a bit, Will.
IRP. I'm sorry.
You were breaking up quite a bit. It was kind of hard to follow you there. I don't know if that happened for anybody else, but it seemed to break up. Can you just capture that thought again that you gave us and tell us again?
I'll try, and I'll try more concisely.
Okay.
Commissioner Hall, I think for SPS's part, at least, it would be, if possible, really helpful to have a clearer understanding of where the Commission feels the combination of existing rules is not serving customers or the public interest. And I recognize there's been open meeting discussion of concern by commissioners of having maybe a disconnect between the IRP and individual actions after the IRP proceeding, and maybe with the IRP process itself as well. But part of SPS's struggle is with the combination of rules and what SPS has already been doing under those rules, and trying to figure out where it is that we want to go compared to that. So that would be a helpful thing as well. But to your original question, absolutely, SPS would engage on what you're describing.
Oh, great. Well, let's see. I don't know if Art's still here. I see his name, Arthur. I don't know exactly how you structured things before, but I recall you saying that the working groups could pick their own time, and then there needed to be some time frame by which they report back to the larger group. Do you have any suggestions here?
Well, first of all, I think that we would solicit involvement so that it's not all utility, for instance, and then have them work on the specific language that they want to bring to a larger group or to the Commission. And that would probably mean that we schedule another workshop at some point. So that would be the way that I'd suggest going, is to have someone be a leader of a subgroup team, and be able to schedule whatever calls that are necessary. Sometimes this can just be done with exchanging of documents, but a telephone call at least is useful to get everybody on the same page. So that's what I would suggest.
Great. And in connection with that, I was intending to suggest that we have another workshop. I mean, from the way this is going, I think we need certainly at least one more workshop, and maybe a couple, because I think we've got several issues here that at least I think could respond to some working group work, and maybe we would end up with better language. And I guess in connection with what Will said, Mr. Dubois, about it's not clear what the commission wants in our language. Well, we're aware of that. There are places where it's not, and that's why we want to get more input from the parties about how they think any of these issues could be resolved, or at least how they are not clear, and try to offer proposals for clearer language so that they would like to see. And if that sort of thing is done in a working group, then we may find that there's some consensus or not. And if not, then at least that was worked out. And when the parties bring that information back to the larger group, then I believe we're farther along than where we were in the past. And it's more time efficient. So if there are other topics that people are interested in working offline on, please feel free to speak up and say what's on your mind, because that's what we want to be doing here, so we can recruit you guys to help us with the creation of a rule that's going to work for everybody.
Ms. Amer and
Yes.
Commissioner Hall.
Yes.
This is Leslie Padilla from P&M. I don't know if these issues could possibly be combined, but I think it would be helpful to have a smaller group of interested folks talk about the adjudication processes that are currently in the proposed rule, timing of those to make sure they're realistic, and what the I think this goes then to the question that was it Mr. Du Bois talked about the RFP, whether the RFP, because that kind of relates somewhat to the presumption of prudence, in that the current draft of the rule in some cases you would not get that presumption of prudence if you do not choose to follow or to issue an RFP as a result of the statement of need. I think I'm getting that right. I might be, but I'd also like to suggest if at another workshop, it might be possible to call on the experience of other states, whether it's by asking, other former commissioners from other states, or staff from other states, to help us understand the way things have worked in their jurisdictions.
Well, just to respond, yes, that caught my attention as well. And I want to look into that and try to reach out to some other state commissioners on the points that arose today. And if anybody has any other has interest in some of our issues that we've identified that you're aware has been addressed in other states, please let Colin know. Funnel it through Colin. He's my assistant, and then we can work on addressing that as well, finding commissioners from those states. This takes time, but I'd rather get it right, and I would rather have our process be as informed as possible from other people's experience. So I like that idea and I appreciate it. And if we can make that, sure, I believe we should at least be able to get someone from Colorado come and talk. But other, like I say, if there are other issues that you're aware of from other states that have bearing on what we're doing, please let Colin know. So Judy, I see a couple of hands up. Steve.
Just to maybe get a little bit back on track, there were some people signed up that I feel like they haven't had an opportunity to say anything, and I want to make sure that they do. Okay. In particular, I'll just list them: Dylan Collin from Affordable Solar, Mark Miller and Joe Fial from Soltage, Jim Desjardins from Renewable Energy Industry Association, and then Domingo Garcia, Hudobro and Melissa Duvall from Malta, and Ben Luxembourg, Devin Hanal from Galehead, and Philip Simpson representing himself, and Stephen Land representing AES Corporation. If any of those people are here and would like to say something, I would like to give those them an opportunity.
Judy, why don't you ask them one at a time like you did?
Oh, okay. I see Jim Desjardins.
Okay.
So he is from Renewable Energy Industries Association of New Mexico.
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah, Jim Desjardins here with Renewable Energy Industry Association of New Mexico. We're known as RIA. Essentially, I put in the chat, just the brief thoughts that I had, but just to kind of go over that. Whatever the decision is in terms of the time frame on the IRPs, I just think it's very important to consider that in the energy sector, and especially in the distributed energy resources sector, that technology is changing very rapidly, and we need to take that into consideration. Thank you, and thank you for the commission for doing this.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I didn't see any of the other organizations raise their hands. But if any of those other organization representatives are interested in talking, please raise your hand. With that, I'll go back to, then there were, I know that Western Resources Advocates potentially was going to have someone. Interwest Energy Alliance, we heard from Ms. Hickey, but she may have other comments. And then Onward Energy, we heard from Joe Yar, but he might have other comments. Would any of those people like to say anything?
Judy, this is Joseph Yar. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you again, Judy and the commission and everyone on the call. I appreciate this opportunity. I think, there's just a host of issues that are coming up. I just wanted to let Ms. Padilla know and Mr. Dubois know that Onward is more than willing to work on draft language and subgroups or work groups. I just wanted you guys to understand that we're open to working together on this one. And I think this is a really important issue for the commission. I think this is something obviously that's been going back to 2018. The role of an independent monitor, evaluator, the IRP, and the competitive bidding is something that is really important to the state of New Mexico and all customers. And so I think it's worth the effort.
Well, thank you. It sounds like you're volunteering for one of the working groups, and we're very happy to hear that. I have a hand raised from Ms. Hickey.
Thank you. And I already said I don't have any real substantive comments, but Interwest Energy Alliance would be glad to work on a work group also if draft language is underway. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so before I interrupted and made sure, I was just trying to make sure that all the participants I see 2 participants have raised their hands. Trying to find out who they are. Or maybe we did them. So
Judy, I'm seeing Anastasia Stevens again,
yes,
and Steve
okay.
Fishman.
Anastasia and Commissioner Fishman.
Right.
Anastasia, why don't you go first, and then we'll have Commissioner Fishman.
Thank you, Judy. I hope it's appropriate, Commissioner Fishman. I just wanted to sort of respond to Mr. Dubois' comments because I think I'm a little confused, but there is a question of chronology here, what the steps are. But remember, I think something to be borne in mind, and this applies especially, but not only, to the multi-jurisdictional utilities, is that the renewable portfolio standard, and to a lesser extent energy efficiency, create a whole bucket of considerations. And the statute is about integrated resource planning. So from the consumer standpoint, we want this, this work product, this integrated resource plan, to give us an opportunity to look at the big picture rather than to have utilities come in with one little thing here, one little thing there. Last year, for El Paso Electric, we had 3 cases, one on PPAs, one on company-owned gas fire generation, and a third under the renewable portfolio standard. And kind of sometimes the twain, sometimes they overlap, sometimes they didn't. It was not an efficient way of doing things. I understand that utilities cannot and should not do an IRP, figure out what we need for this 20 years, and go do some massive all source RFP, but some sort of order would be to everybody's benefit. And that's what integrated resource planning, I think, was meant to be when the legislature came up with that. So, and we'll participate, hopefully not too much, but I'd like to be invited to meetings, if not join them. Thank you. And thank you very much, everybody, for having these meetings.
Yeah, so I hear you saying that whatever our process is, you want an order from the commission at the end of the process. Is that what you're saying?
Not quite. I think that this process does lead to an order from the commission if there is to be a presumption granted. I don't see any way, even if it's a rebuttable presumption, I cannot see how a unilateral filing by the utility can grant, can create a rebuttable presumption unless it's a process by which the consumers suddenly have the weight to fight a filing, which is somewhat what it became after the 2018 amendments to the rule. But that's not really the main point. The main point is that integration and a big picture look at the resources should remain the focus of this process and not the minutiae of how you get there, because we don't want to be paying for the same things 3 times. We don't want to be going through three hearings if they're overlapping. And this is probably a larger question that falls into the RPS rule as well, renewable energy rule as well. But as we get into the higher amounts of renewable energy integration, that's a challenge to EPE and SPS who don't have that requirement in Texas. But it's one that we should go into with our eyes wide open and with the best information and earliest information, which is always subject to adjustment and hopefully improvement.
Thank you. That clarifies it very well. Thank you. And Commissioner Fishman, you're on mute. You're muted, Commissioner. Thank you.
I'm not muted anymore, am I?
No, I can hear you very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'm afraid to say Will's name because Dubois or Dubois, I don't know which. So Will, can you set us all straight on how to pronounce your name? I feel bad that you keep getting it butchered.
We may need to have a workshop process on that. There's a split between folks in my family, but I usually go with Dubois.
Dubois. Thank you. Everybody, you don't have to go on mute, but just say after me. Will, say it again.
Du Bois.
Du Bois. Thank you all. And sorry, Will, because we're all butchering your name, and we should get it right. Du Bois.
All I can say is this workshop was successful because we now know how to say Will's name, right?
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Fishman.
Sure. And then second of all, just real quickly, Ms. Stevens, I think from my perspective, I'll speak personally, I do think this rulemaking is a great opportunity to harmonize processes such as the long-term planning, the RFP process, and the CCN process. And that should always be the goal, is how do these pieces fit together so that we don't duplicate work and we don't create extra work. So that certainly is my focus in doing this. And, I hope everyone else's as well. And third, just as the closing comment, I wanted to thank Commissioner Hall for being fiercely committed to addressing these issues and not letting it go. And I think we're making good progress. I think people are making really good comments that are well worth thinking through and working out. So I just wanted to thank Commissioner Hall in particular for having the vision to push this, and everybody else for participating. And I'm now shutting up. Thank you all.
Thank you, Steve. I know I've been a pest, so we're getting somewhere.
No, you're committed, and I would concur with that statement by Commissioner Fishman. I don't know if anyone else has any comments, but please raise your hand. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Commissioner Hall to talk about how to organize a working group.
Oh, thank you, Judy. Well, actually, I was about to say that we should just reiterate, I believe the process is, and Arthur, correct me if I'm wrong, that Arthur will send out an email to people inviting them to join the one working group, I guess we've got identified. And I guess, let's see, I guess I directed people to Colin with their suggestions about other working groups. So maybe Colin could, forward that information on to Arthur, or Arthur, would you rather they just send their suggestions about other working groups to you directly? We can do it that way. That's not a problem.
I think that they should send it to Colin, not to, load him up with a lot of work, and then he and I will confer on process. It's just, I have been having some email troubles with my state of New Mexico email, and I don't want things to get lost. So it would be better if things went to Colin.
That works for me, Commissioner and Art.
Great. And then I suppose we should address the timing issue of all this. Maybe it's better to see who all responds. And but I guess what we need to do is generate some sort of calendar for future workshops. I mean, I would expect we want at least 2 more workshops. I would say 2. One would just be suitable for, incorporating information we get from working groups to the extent they've been able to form and meet. And that doesn't seem like that would be sufficient to just finally reach resolution on everything. It would just be the opportunity to receive their information. I think we would need a 4th working group to, fourth workshop where we can get back to communicate following digesting the information we've gotten from working groups. Any thoughts on that, Art, or anybody? Does the idea of 2 more workshops make everybody's head explode or anything? I mean, I know.
I think that's a very good idea, Commissioner Hall, but maybe one at a time. So for instance,
sure. Schedule them one at a time.
Plan the next one, but also give the working group enough time to meet.
Right.
And,
right.
And come up with not even one, even if they can't come to a consensus, at least they could come up with proposals for the next workshop. That would be my suggestion.
So maybe we should ask to hear from at least the two parties we're aware of who are interested in that, which would be Leslie and Will. Is that correct? It's probably premature to ask you guys when you think you would, anticipate trying to get together. But maybe if you could just get back to, and we don't have to schedule the next workshop yet, but I suppose we want to put some sort of time framework on it. What would you say, a month or 3 weeks or something like that? Do you need to consult your schedules and each other first?
Commissioner Hall, this is Leslie Padilla. Yes, I think we need time to just look at our schedules. I think both PNM and SPS, and everyone here on this call has a lot of proceedings currently happening, but we can do that. I just wanted to make sure I understand. Would we be meeting in workshops based on the current draft of the rule, or would your assistants want to at all turn around a new draft for us to go from? Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
The answer is I don't know, but I think to the extent you can generate new language, you can be sure we'd look at it for purposes of including it.
So PNM is, since we've suggested this workshop, and I'm kind of pulling Steve Schwebke into this as well, because he would, work with me to on getting folks together and convening it. But we would be willing to either lead or co-lead a workshop.
And I think the term we want,
a work group.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent. And so that's fine. So we'll hear back from you what a productive time frame would be for you guys to get together. And I'm just guessing it would be probably within a month, wouldn't it? That you would be able to get together. I don't.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, great, super. And I just want to throw this out there. I know the issue of multi-jurisdictional utilities difficulties is a big one, and I'd like to ask the utility folks if they think that's an area where it might be profitable to have a working group to work on language they'd like to propose. If they think they could, if they think it makes sense at all to do. Oh, I see Catherine Collins saying he's already receiving emails on those interested in participating in working groups. That's great. I don't know he didn't say which working groups, but were any of those people who emailed Colin talking about multi-jurisdictional issues? I'd be interested to know.
No, Commissioner, there wasn't any specificity, but I do believe that that's something that yourself and Art and I can work out when we go out with the invitations for the working groups.
Okay, fine. Thanks, Colin.
Certainly.
Great.
Yeah, I'm going to recommend that we set up a call just for the people who want to be in the working group as a kind of organizational call, and do that sometime next week. It'll be less formal than a workshop, and then we can parse what areas of the rule should be worked on and who's willing to do that. Because really all I'm hearing is that there's interest in aligning the various contract approval processes, the PPA process and the CCN process with the procurement section, because we didn't really address that. And there's interest in working on an independent monitor section. Am I missing any other area of interest? Because that's, to me, two different groups.
This is Joseph Yar speaking again. I just wanted to echo Mrs. Padilla's comments before we have this separate call or the subgroups that we're talking about, that we get a final, at least commission rule, that a draft that we are all kind of working on. I'm a little bit confused as to, from today's call, what everyone is referring to. It seems like there's a couple of different versions out, and I'm not completely convinced I have what everybody else is looking at. So if there could be a filing or an email from someone saying this is what we're all talking about in advance of that meeting, I would really appreciate that.
Well,
okay.
Yes.
For me, the only thing that I've heard that we were going to change was changing the planning horizon from 10 years to 20 years. That was like the only solid suggestion of change that I hear, right?
Well, although I do think we were going to, there were some questions about the meaning of certain sections as we sent them out that we may want to look at and say, oh, I thought, we thought that was clear, but obviously it wasn't clear. So here we can make it more clear. I heard a lot of those type of comments.
So Judy, maybe we should, and Colin, we should make a cleaned up version and send that out.
Yes,
based
Commissioner.
on the problems we identified today.
Yes, Commissioner, and I think the rebuttable presumption might be one of those areas that we can clean up, at least to provide a baseline, a foundation for the working groups.
Well, I think that's the language they want to work on. I don't know that we should alter what we've got there now because they want to work on it.
Okay, understood,
So,
Commissioner. Thank you.
Just a thought that might be helpful for everybody is where issues have been raised, but we're not making a change. When we send out the updated rule for the 20 years and whatever other changes, we should also maybe have a short list of the key issues that were raised in this meeting that are still being discussed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that might help keep everybody on track.
Commissioner Fishman, I've been taking copious notes, so I think we'll definitely be able to deliver on that. Thank you.
And to the extent recipients of that list see it and think that they want to start a working group on any of those issues, that would be helpful too.
Well, with that, I would think that this workshop may be concluded unless anyone else has any other item they want to bring up. Well, really appreciate all the comments and participation here today. And I look forward to more comments and participation and workshops and ultimately a notice of proposed rulemaking that would satisfy a majority of the people here.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks for running the meeting. And I can't thank everybody enough for being here and participating. It's very, very helpful.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. All right.